Hello guys, how are you all? Welcome to my channel. So, today we are gonna see, what if Naruto Uzumaki was the pilot one of the most advanced starships? Naruto X Mass Effect crossover, movie 1. Subscribe if you enjoyed the video, and also make sure to check out the author of this fanfic, TRANE7, and support him for writing this awesome fanfic. Link is in the description. Let's start the story. The skies of the elemental nations were, as bright and beautiful as one may find, dotted with white clouds that spread onwards over the land, sending it in its web of perfection. It was amidst this picturesque view that one Kitaro Uzumaki was staring at. He had the largest grin one would have ever seen, as he dusted off whatever microscopic speck that had taken residence on his white officer dress. The Uzumaki had the brightest twinkle in his violet eyes with neatly combed striking red hair. Kitaro was literally bouncing with excitement. "Kitaro, please stop looking yourself over," so weird. The male turned to give his sister an annoyed huff. "Whatever, Hinoka, but when I'm famous you'll be rendered speechless." His younger sister Hinoka giggled to herself. She had blue cerulean eyes with the same bright crimson hair he did. Two bangs framed her face with a third that went down her middle. She was wearing a form-fitting blue dress with orange accents on the side. Yes, my older brother Kitaro, the masterful captain of his ship." She gave him a knowing smile while striding past the space between them. "But you'll always be my family." She hugged his arm tightly, eyebrows creased together, as her blue eyes began drenched in worry. Kitaro rolled his eyes before sighing in exasperation. "I'll be fine, Hinoka, you don't need to worry." But that didn't seem to drop the matter for her, as her grip tightened to near unbearable proportions. "I'm your sister. It's my job to worry, especially when you're all I have left." There was a brief well of tears that gathered at the peak of her eyes before she forced them back. "But I'm taking your time. The ceremony is about to begin." Kitaro nodded his head, happy to see her gone before walking off to the door, his sister not far behind him. "Stay safe up there, Kitaro." He watched his sister's pleading eyes, and couldn't help the wide grin that spread across his face. "I should say the same to you, Jonin Hinoka Uzumaki of the 51st Gun Brigade." The Uzumaki twinkle shined through her orbs now, as she slapped his arm playfully. "I'm just a reserve now, and I like that position." Kitaro smiled. He never liked it when his sister was sad, especially when it involved him. "May Kami watch over you, and may the Force luck be with you." Kitaro smiled when her sister mentioned that, kissing her forehead softly. "I'm sure our great Uzumaki is smiling down at me." They broke contact with one another, as he slid into his chakra-powered automobile, closing the door, and priming the ignition. He was slightly satisfied when he heard the sound of the chakra engine turning on, but just to make sure it was all okay, he pumped some of his potent Uzumaki chakra into the system. "I'll be watching the television," his sister informed him, and he gave her a quick nod in response before the door shut, and his vehicle sped out of the driveway, and the Uzumaki compound within Konoha City. As he drove, he looked upwards to the great city that loomed over him. The great skyscrapers of modern architecture, and the near-invisible scars of the Fourth Shinobi World War that happened nearly a millennium ago. Kitaro grinned when he thought back to the stories his sister used to tell him. Stories of the great Uzumaki, Rakudame of Konohagakure no Sato, son of the Yellow Flash of Konoha, and the Red Death of Yuzashigakure no Sato, member of the 9 Guardians of Shinobi no Kai, and the savior of the world, who went toe-to-toe with the infamous Madara Uchiha, and Obito Uchiha with such unparalleled strength and conviction that won him the title of the Nidaime Rakuto Sennin. Since so long ago, the world of Shinobi no Kai has grown so much, expanding throughout their lands with explorations and science. They have met so many new people and civilizations, and ushered in centuries of prosperous advancements and wealth. Every inch of their world had been colonized and searched before the people of Shinobi no Kai began work to explore space. And they did. Kitaro thought mildly, as he double-checked his captain's uniform. As he said this, he passed into view of a massive Sarutobi-class starship that was currently docked in the Nidaime harbor. The massive ship, easily a solid 5 kilometers long, it was the pride of the Shinobi fleet, as being the most dangerous ship to have ever been crafted using infinite chakra submission engines, and the most state-of-the-art ballistics and sealed systems ever crafted installed into the weapons systems. This beauty of a ship, as Kitaro thought, as his car engines revved to his own feelings. There was a certain pride in his eyes, as his gaze landed on the name of the ship. Written in big blocky white letters was the name Kurama, in remembrance to the 9-tailed Biju that had watched over Konoha City in its golden age. Eyes facing forward again, the Redeed smiled, as he pulled to a stop next to the stage, where currently all of the officers were currently seated. Pushing himself out, he was less than disappointed to see Carlos Fernan, a local from the lands of the West, standing next to a podium with his first officer's uniform on. Next to him, Yumi Yamanaka was doing the same, only her uniform was an altered version for a female. A navy blue patch was attached to her right arm, signifying her rank as the sector commander of the fighter division. Behind the two of them stood Rear Admiral Tuchi Senju, the old man having more campaign ribbons and medals adorning his uniform than the number of wrinkles on his face. The Rear Admiral was wearing an all-grey admiral's uniform with the insignia for the Grand First Royal Navy adorning his right side. Next to the Admiral was Akio Haruno, the former captain in charge of the Sarutobi-class starship. The female flashed Kitaro a disarming smile before returning her steady gaze to the crowd with parade precision. When Kitaro took his position next to his first officer, Rear Admiral Tucci took a step towards the podium. Ladies and gentlemen of the naval fleet, Kitaro marveled slightly at the near emotionless tone the Rear Admiral was sporting as he delivered his speech to thousands of naval personnel that were to crew the Kurama. We gather here today to announce the service of one of the Royal Navy's first ever Saratobi-class exploration and defense starship designated Kurama. Take heart, young shinobi of the elemental nations, the gunmen of the west, the minds of the east, and the colonists of the south. You will all travel to system far distant from known shinobi-controlled space. But fear not, for you will face hardships and obstacles. But in the words of one of our greatest heroes, we endure, do not falter. Do not break heart, for you shall be the carriers of our will. And with this, you shall be the ones to usher in a new golden age for our people. The Rear Admiral took a step back before snapping a salute, a hand over his heart, and eyes facing the sky. For our people, these words were echoed by everyone in the area, as even Kitaro snapped a quick salute. Now onwards to your stations, and prepare for liftoff, and may the fourth watch over you. As he has always been, Kitaro Uzumaki smiled a foxy grin, as he turned 180 degrees to look at the marvelous ship he was to command. Nudging his first officer, the soon-to-be captain was less than surprised to see the same excitement in his eyes. Carlos took careful and practiced steps towards the open hangar bay doors alongside Kitaro, and the Uzumaki smiled the biggest smile he had ever known. Man, if only Hinoka was here. Captain Rentaro Takadono stood atop his bridge aboard the NSA Forever. The captain was a tall young male with brown hair and had a decorated captain's uniform on. Flanking him was his first officer, Darren Kovsky, while several naval officers worked around them to navigate the ship. Captain Rentaro Takadono was in charge of the Shinobi's 6 R&D fleet, in conjunction with the Shinobi Anbu Corps. His fleet of 6 300-meter engineering ships were surrounded by several of the Anbu Bushido-class cruisers, ranging from 500 meters to 700 meters. Just recently, the Anbu Recon Corps had discovered an alien artifact on the outskirts of the Delsto system, and it was the job of the R&D fleet to find out what exactly is its purpose. As such, the Shinobi Intelligence Division, the successor to the Konoha Intelligence Division, were very keen on finding out what this artifact did, and managed to get the Anbu to repurpose some of their cruisers to assist in safeguarding them. Captain Rentaro smoothed out any edges on his uniform, as Darren continued to relay orders to the naval personnel. "What's the word on the fleet, Darren?" Rentaro turned to his So, and wasn't surprised to see him diligently working with the NARS. "The fleet is responding green on all channels, and have analyzed an estimated 50% of the artifact's design, and theorized most likely function, sir." Rentaro hummed in approval on how fast work was being done, and asked for Darren to continue. "The artifact is made up of two 15-kilometer long arms surrounding a set of revolving, gyroscopic rings, with an unknown energy core reminiscent of chakra, though atomic structures differ. From what we can garner from its appearance and overall power output, the device could be a form of cannon. However, the main theory is that it's supposed to be used for space travel." Rentaro looked surprised with that notion, an eyebrow delicately raised in question. "From what we can understand, this thing only points in one direction, which is outside the system towards a previously undiscovered area of space." The captain rubbed his chin in deep thought, looking at the artifact with a newfound amazement, but couldn't help but scoff, as the commissioned the Kurama carried an updated Namicus-class engine, capable of space travel across systems using the famed fourth Hokage's ability to teleport through use of dimensional travel. Thinking back about the Kurama, Captain Rentaro couldn't help but wish the ship was here with the fleet. Kurama has been the subject of attention for the past few months. Already it was named the crown jewel of the Navy. The ship had proceeded to eliminate several pirate gangs all throughout the outer systems, and went on to demolish several slave traders occupying the planet Crypt. The captain of the ship, Kitaro Uzumaki, had been awarded a medal a few weeks ago for his distinction in his few short months of service. As far as Rentaro was concerned, the military was simply kissing the captain of the Kurama's ass to show the civilians that they were progressing in terms of technology, but it was working. Already funding for a second Saratobi-class ship was being poured into the military's hands in waves. But alas, the Kurama was busy with other business, and Rentaro severely doubted anything extraordinary would happen. "Any other news?" Rentaro asked. Darren shook his head in the negative, and the captain stole a moment to marvel at the foreign architecture. In contrast to the utilitarian design of the shinobi ships, made for the practicality of eventual combat than actual aesthetics, the thing was beautiful. Just then the two of the Anbu cruisers flew past the captain's ship, and he couldn't help but suck in his breath, as the Anbu's smooth ships flanked the foreign beauty in such a way that he was sure this piece of technology would bring with it a boon in shinobi technology. "Darren, is there any way for us to activate it?" To his credit, Darren didn't even flinch to the question, and responded evenly, "Yes, sir. We've gathered enough information of the operating systems for a plausible activation of the artifact." Now this was where being a captain really made it stressful, the decisions. This may not seem as all that important nor as demanding as the decisions made in combat, however it was no less important. There were so many variables that needed to be taken into consideration. What if it would blow up upon activation? What if it leads nowhere? What if it sends them to a warmongering civilization? These questions plagued the captain, and seeing a truly alien artifact in person only leaves more anxiety to the answers. Activate it, contact the Anga cruisers, and alert them to what's happening. Darren nodded his head in the affirmative, and contacted the other transports using the radio seals devised by the Yamanaka clan. As they did, Captain Rentaro began to mentally prepare himself. By all accounts he had the clearance and rights to begin such a groundbreaking moment. However, Rentaro knew he should be more careful. Which is why, Rentaro thought, the Anbu ships are here. Outside, in the vacuum of space, the 14 ships started to form a formation towards the alien artifact, creating a sort of V-shape, as one lone engineering ship drifted closer to the center of attention to perform what would be recorded as the start of an entirely new year. The NSA forever drifted closer and closer to the alien artifact, an uneasy feeling rising out of Rentaro's gut as it did. The Naras on board were keenly observing the contraption with shrewd eyes. As the ship drew closer, Rentaro observed the few moments before what would be an era-changing event. He noted the excited and nervous expressions of his crew, the ready and alertness of the Anbu cruisers, and the stoic face of his Zo. Hopefully, Rentaro thought, that face would be smiling in greeting to new friends. When the ship was mere meters from the device, one of the Naras inputted a code into a terminal, where several Yamanaka transmission seals later sent out various signals towards the device, making use of the lesser-used electronic signal, rather than the telepathic signal favored by pilots. "Sir, there's a spike of energy coming through the device. It's pulling us in." Rentaro gritted his teeth as long arms of electricity arched onto the Forever, and then passed throughout the fleet, ending with the last Anbu cruiser at the end of the fleet. The artifact began pulsing, as its gyroscopic rings increased in tempo, reacting to the foreign energy source inside the ship with a machine equivalent to surprise before it settled, and launched the ships through the relay, and towards its partner relay. Order of Turian-controlled space. 6:45 p.m. Galactic Standard Time. Turian Patrol Fleet. Captain Focus Region was a Turian in service to the hierarchy, respectable, cut, and dry officer straight out of boot. Focus Region was a veteran captain that had seen many skirmishes with Batarian pirates, and one or two brave ships. His patrol fleet, the few frigates and cruisers unimportant to the main fleet at this time, were riding along the outer edges of Turian-controlled space, and, as the hours ticked by, the male had to admit it was a rather boring and routine patrol that every Turian officer knew would mean a slow payday. Focus remained still and quiet as he sat comfortably rigid in his seat, maintaining the Turians ready at all time minute. The Turian, though pointless, took the time to go over various reports from Turians in the engine room on the Mass Effect cores, to help keep himself busy from the boredom that he was sure would ensue. As far as he was concerned, the only problem his ship was facing was a faulty light bulb in the barracks. Everything else was as efficient as it was when it came off the assembly line. "Sir?" Focus was quick to respond to the call of his subordinate, a young promising Turian named Severus, who would have done well as a captain. "Scanners are detecting an illegal activation of Relay 114. It's a primary relay." Immediately Focus' mandibles spread open, a Turian equivalent to a grin, as he wondered what foolish pirate gang would have the gall to disobey a Citadel law. Focus gave Severus a look, and spoke the only words that he knew: "Prepare combat stations. We'll have to teach them a lesson." The Turians nodded, and dutifully punched in codes and numbers into their terminals. That was mirrored by the other ships in the Turian small fleet. A fleet Focus thought would be enough to deal with this. Focus had to flare his mandibles, as he thought he may have stumbled upon a warmongering race. Their ships lacked any design aesthetics, and was built with the obvious intention to deal damage. They were boxed and utilitarian in design, nothing of the sort indicating a civilian touch. A number of small autocannons lined the sides of the ships, and a massive cannon underneath it. The ships were no less menacing than the Turian zone, and the captain could see many of the young hopefuls flare their mandibles, eager to prove their worth. "Scan them. Do you detect any element 0 readings?" Focus asked. There was a short silence before Severus made a gesture for no. Focus couldn't help but grin again. An enemy with no traces of element 0 meant no Mass Effect cores, no Mass Effect shields, no Mass Effect cannons, therefore in his mind a technologically inferior threat. "Get the cruisers to form a line. We open fire now." Severus nodded his head, and sent a transmission through the fleet. Quickly and efficiently Focus saw his cruisers line up with his, and ready their cannons, and then fired. If Focus had paid attention, then he would have noticed how the ships weren't in any actual order, and were in fact merely drifting through space, a glaring symptom of a mass power failure, as the chakra in their systems couldn't cope with the sudden intrusion of the foreign energy, which had led to mass malfunctions through their systems. The male sent a telepathic signal between him and a Yamanaka at Anbu HQ, and sent as many memories he could compress, before he felt the sweet bliss of oblivion take over when his ship blew up. In an instant the defenseless fleet was destroyed, and the Turians would have burned into their minds the start of a bloody war. "Any more of them?" Focus asked. Severus made another motion no, and the captain nodded his head. "Search the ships. The hierarchy would want prisoners to question." In a current hearing within the planet Palavan, the various primarchs were currently discussing an incident that happened with one of their border patrols. The primaries had always been crisp and clear to the point in each meeting, but this was the very first day an uneasy silence had filled the meeting hall. They all knew what had just happened, an event that many within Citadel space had not hoped to ever transpire again. First contact, and not by the Citadel's hand. Do the Solarians know of this? Primer Chadmus asked. What he had received were grim nods of negative. We kept everything vocal, and even then under heavy terms Primer Chlegius replied grimly. They all knew what would happen if Solarians were involved. Turians would be blindsided, and another century or so of debate and inaction, allowing this new enemy time to consolidate their forces. Primer Chadmus, your systems are closer to the recent events than ours. What exactly happened? Immediately all eyes turned to Primer Chadmus, who immediately leaned his back against his seat when he realized the weight put upon him. If he worded things right, then the Turians might gain a new client race. If not, then a mere devastation of the enemy fleet would be in order to make sure they didn't do this again. From what we can gather, the unknown race had activated a previously inactive Relay 114. Patrol Fleet Captain Focus responded to the breach of Citadel law and proceeded to exterminate the transgressors. Edmus's voice was solemn, but also hard and cold. He had no sympathy for those who break the law. Upon contact with the unknowns, Captain Focus immediately dealt with them, eliminating the lawbreakers. Their ships possess no traces of Element Zero, and we have theorized that they don't have a means of faster-than-light travel. Murmurs broke out among the primaries. If that was true, then whatever on the other side of the relay was no doubt the aliens' homeworld. How do they travel then? Primarch Vecker asked. Tribal perhaps. Savages. One primarch suggested. Edmus made the Turian equivalent to a shrug. He didn't have a clue to what half of it was, and he had seen the pictures. Had the patrol fleet captured any survivors? Legius asked. Items made a nod, and the Turians flashed their proud mandibles when a hologram sprang to life between them. A single-shaped life form was sprawled on the ground, chains holding his hands together, and a stream of red liquid traveling down his mouth. The alien, though pale and sickly looking, was glaring at his Turian guards, one holding a baton, and the other calmly speaking to him. As you can see, it isn't talking, and the few moments of speech it was willing to give our translators were incapable of deciphering it, Edmus replied. Where is he held? Legius asked. He is currently held in the colony world Galedia closest to Relay 114. The primarchs sat silently after this, all of them thinking hard on the best course of action, and the only option any Turian would have gone with, the law. Edmus, is that patrol fleet captain still in the system? Legius asked. Edmus gave a brisk nod, and immediately the few remaining silent primarchs began speaking up with promises and plans to reinforce the patrol fleet with a dreadnought, cruisers, frigates, and an admiral. The Turians never did things at the minimum. No, they much rather preferred to go in heavy-handed. Even as they spoke, even before the meeting had even begun, those very ships had already been dispatched with very clear orders: eliminate the enemy and secure their home planet. Iju system, 12 AM Shinobi Standard Time, orbiting station. Council. Hovering just above the Shinobi homeworld was the station that the Council of the Shinobi Alliance would often use to discuss matters of great importance. These chambers had housed many of the Shinobi Alliance's many great events that had been fought with the pen, rather than the gun, peaceful negotiations, the planning of military assets during the colonial war, and more importantly, the recent news of the destruction of Captain Rentaro, and his ambush ship sent to investigate an unknown, possibly alien artifact. Vice Admiral Sato Nar, High Cage Army Commander Kevin Goldfield, High Cage Ikra Commander Takumi, and Anbu Commander Falcon. These were the highest-ranking members of the Shinobi Alliance, the most influential men beside the Cage herself. At this very moment, these people of great power were in a deep discussion of the events that had happened to Captain Rentaro and his R&D fleet. Could it have been pirates? Rear Admiral Ben asked, his tone of voice suggesting his remark was merely half-hearted. Highly unlikely. Pirates may be getting desperate, but not that desperate. Besides, the Kurama ended their little gang long before they were able to unify themselves to become an actual threat. Guro's gruff and gravelly voice was straight to the point as he shifted on his chair's wheels. Face it, people, the Shinobi have just made first contact with a hostile extraterrestrial force. Tuchi's calm, deep baritone stirred everyone in surprise. It wasn't his voice, more so what he had just mentioned. Silence filled the room, as none dared to speak above the Cage, and merely sat silently, watching in awe, as this 25-year-old Cage had just silenced a room full of naval veterans, and the most top-ranking of soldiers. The Cage passed her eyes over the seated member before she laced her fingers together, while propping her elbows onto the table. When the 5 great Cages formed the Shinobi Alliance, it was made with the promise to defend citizens of the Alliance, which was then extended to space-faring humans. Their pupils darted to one of her advisors. Not turning her head, she addressed, "What of the fleet stationed in the Delsto system?" Anna asked. The old ragged male cupped his chin in deep thought, hard and experienced eyes reflecting old reports that had landed on his desk months ago. Following the passing of the Colonial Act, the only inhabiting ships in the Delsto system are docked on the only inhabitable planet Lao. It's within my understanding that the only ships there are 10 Bushido-class cruisers, 5 Sickle-class corvettes, and nothing more. Tucci was the first to speak. The first royal fleet is currently a month's travel away from the Delsto system, and if we move now we could reach there earlier. The admirals gave Tucci a wondering look, but none pressed him on his decision. The Anbu fleet is only made up of corvettes, frigates, and cruisers. However, there are nearby assets that I can send towards the Delsto systems. Falcon's voice was clear and crisp, no emotion, and no hesitation, the way an Anbu operative should speak. What of the Kurama? Anna asked. Vice Admiral Sato loosed his collar, as all eyes turned to him, and before he could speak Tsubaki made it prudent to quell any argument he may have. The Naras, though brilliant, were always cautious. It is to my understanding that the Kurama has an updated Namicus-class engine that could possibly reach the Delsto system, half the time the royal fleet could. It could provide an advantage to the colony's fleet. Nara shut his mouth, though he could rebuke her looking at the eyes of his fellow admirals, and even the cage, he knew he had lost this battle. The Kurama can be sent to assist the Delsto system ahead of the first royal fleet. As soon as you give the word cage, Sama Anna was silent for a moment, a myriad of thoughts going through her mind. Anbu Commander Falcon, I want your ships to try and garner any intelligence on the enemy fleet, and if possible take one, as a prisoner. I don't care how you do it, but I want it done. Tucci, even with the Kurama I would imagine there would still be stiff resistance from the enemy. As such I'm giving you the order to reinforce the Delsto fleet. The Shinobi Alliance will be placed under red alert until further notice. We will not bow to this new enemy no matter the consequence, am I clear? The silent nods were enough for her, and the meeting quickly ended. The Turian captain stood proudly on the deck of the Turian dreadnought Perseverance. The Turians flared proud mandibles, as he watched many young Turian hopefuls man their stations, and prepare the fleet for what was to be expected a crushing defeat for the inferior enemy. Focus Region will not say he takes pride in this, in fact he does not, but he does take pride in the good he has done. Though his methods were questionable, and he himself admitted to be very rash and unfair, Turian knew what he had done was right. As a captain who had fought against Batarian slavers and pirates, the Turian male was no doubt hardened for decisions that may prove immoral. Attacking a technologically inferior race that was glaringly new to space travel was no great jump for pride, and in fact when he reported it to his superiors in the colony world Galeria, he had gotten some surprise, and even wondering looks. But Facus didn't mind. He was a Turian, and like all Turians whatever he did was for the good of the hierarchy. This new and technologically new race wouldn't last a minute in Citadel space with the Batarians and Krogans. They would be safer under Turian protection, as a client race than to be accepted as a member of the Citadel species. Putting into the fact the image of the Turians upholding their responsibility as peacekeepers of the galactic community and maintaining their position in the Citadel Council, this soon-to-be slaughter was a necessary evil. As Faces looked at the young faces, he saw hesitancy and even disgust. Yes, massacre of an inferior species has a tendency to deflate a person's pride. But the Primarches, whether in his vision or not, have ordered the forward assault on these new alien species, and whether the soldiers wanted to or not, it wasn't up to them. Focus just hoped that in time the Turians, and even this new race, would see this as a changing moment in their lives, where they could both prosper well enough together. Yes, I do believe so. The new admiral in charge of the fleet, Phobos Brooklyn, was a good admiral, and Focus knew he wouldn't jeopardize the safety of the alien race unjustly. Yes, Foss knew this would all be for the better. The captain gave Severus a nod of understanding, clasped a talon on the young Turian's shoulder, and then moved towards the docking bay doors. As he passed, some Turians gave him nods of respect, while some were slow and hesitant. It seems news of his deeds had spread faster than he hoped. Severus, once we're on board the ship I want the Turian ground troops prepared and ready for a ground fight. We're not gonna bombard them to extinction. We have to capture the planet and occupy it, understood? Severus gave an affirmative, and by the time the Turians had stopped their conversation, they were already at the bridge on board the cruiser Justice. Severus made a salute, then slid back into his chair off to the captain's side, while the captain himself took a seat on the captain's chair. Calmly waiting for the kilometer-length dreadnought to lead the ship onwards, which it did, the admiral even giving a small honest speech on the most likely outcome, and expressed his contempt on the situation. The ship soared through space in faster-than-light speeds, and when the captain was satisfied that they were almost there, he ordered his men to prepare their weapons. He wanted it done quickly and painlessly for both sides. Focus shook his head, and tried to shut the voices away. There was no turning back now. Sir, unknown contacts. 10 cruisers, and 1 dreadnought, possibly hostile, sir. Focus eyes snapped forward. He had expected that the fleet his patrol had encountered outside the relay wasn't all their ships, but he hadn't expected them to have a dreadnought. Almost immediately he was contacted by the admiral of the fleet. Admiral Phobos Brooklyn Ficus Frieded. The Turian admiral was dressed in the uniform of an admiral, which admittedly could have been passed off as armor, and he was looking disgruntled. I remember your report specifically emphasizing how this species is not at a technological state, as we are. He wasn't happy. Focus expected as much. Faulty intelligence was worse than no intelligence at all. Yes sir, I did. The enemy had no ratings of element EZO, and their ships had no defense against our ships. More than likely I would suspect the dreadnought to be a colony vessel. Focus tried to appease Venus' accusatory fire, assuring him his soldiers wouldn't die, at least not too many. Focus wasn't naive to think the unknown didn't have any defenses. Right, Phobos's mandibles flared slightly, a type of warning for Focus that said you'd better be right before the communication line cut off. Focus eased himself into his chair. He couldn't help but respect the species' stubbornness. They would benefit greatly from the Turians, and their people may even make exceptional auxiliary forces. But when the ships drew closer towards the alien homeworld, inching closer and closer, Focus couldn't help but feel as though the stars themselves were retreating farther and farther away from them, as if they expected a cataclysm to happen, and self-preservation dictated to flee. It was not until a few minutes later that he knew why. Smack dab at the center of an enemy formation was a massive dreadnought that could have outsized the Destiny Ascension's 3.4 kilometer length. The Turian found himself impressed with this race's ability at engineering, and found himself particularly eyeing the cannon located at its underside. That thing's a monster. Focus didn't chide the naval man for speaking out of turn, and merely marveled at its utilitarian design. The ship had a grace only military veterans could respect. At the center of 10 cruisers, it was like a mother of thresher maws protecting her brood. No doubt the leader of the attack was located on board the ship. This Admiral Vobus Brooklyn. All ships mark your targets. Once we eliminate the dreadnought, open fire. Smart move, Focus thought. Eliminating the enemy symbol of strength, and they would break. Disrupting their chain of command was an added bonus. The following chaos would allow the Turians to cut cleanly through the enemy line. The captain ordered his cruiser to position itself next to the Turian dreadnought, the other cruisers doing the same, and formed a tight formation, the frigates already preparing their wolf packs to eliminate any runners. A sudden surge was detected from one of the terminals nearby Focus's seat. He eyed it, anticipating it to go off with the discharge of the dreadnought's main cannon, a cannon that made 90% of the ship itself. The terminal blinked red, and then with a loud boom it was launched. In all actuality, from vacuum he heard nothing, but from just looking, as the bolt of metal soared through the darkness, he could imagine the sound. The slug traveled at a velocity of 40-25 km that one could barely keep up with the naked eye, and when it slammed against the enemy ship, particles and explosive chemical dusted off the ship's hull, and Focus had every right to expect the dreadnought to be gone. But when the dust cleared, the Turian was slack-jawed, or slack-mandibles. As the alien ship stood strong and powerful, the dreadnought seemed to shake with anger at the Turians for even daring to attack it, and like its namesake, which the Turians did not know about, it was pissed. Suddenly the underbarrel of the ship lit up, and Focus was able to notice more of those strange markings he had found on the other ships that had passed through the relay. They were intricate, and ended with many circles, and veins of oddly made lines spreading from there, encompassing most of the ship in a grand design. What happened next induced panic into the Turian's heart. The dreadnought began buckling forward, as arcs of electricity began splashing against its barriers. The kinetic energy of the coil itself caused the barrier to falter, but with the sudden zap of, not electricity, but a far more volatile substance, began to shut down the dreadnought's defense. It was like a barrier, but at the same time not. When the slug reached a certain point of the ship, a warp would happen in between the deadly projectile and the ship itself, much like a singularity, only more natural. What happened next Focus could only speculate, as the projectile did detonate, but it just disappeared right afterwards. By the spirits, I made a mistake, Focus swore. This civilization wasn't the helpless new spacefaring species he once thought. They were a powerful, intelligent species that did not rely on EZO, and even though EZO was many times declared the best and only form of space travel, fighting a powerful unknown like this did little to ease Focus's worries, even if they were at a technological advantage. On board NSA the Karama, Captain Kitaro Uzumaki, shields are holding. The crystallized chakra core is holding at peak efficiency. Small arms fire from the enemy fighters. Strengthening seals keeping the hull integrity at 98%. We're moving forward. Get a PDS, Point Defense System, online. Nani Inizuka, the pilot in charge of navigation and control, asked her co-pilot Jacob Stinson, in charge of weapons and operations. Jacob snorted, as he slapped several runes located on his chair's armrest, sliding 4 fingers through several slides, as the ship began to vibrate with the launching of the PDS Quick Impact Chakra Coil, a smaller version of the Chakra Impact Coil, used on the enemy flagship. Those bugs are getting really annoying. Kiro grimaced, as another one of those oddly shaped fighters flew across the bridge main viewport. And I thought our fighters were daring. All around, the captain naval officers were working like clockwork, racing between stations and terminals to keep the fleet apprised to the situation, and alerting engineering crews to damages. Carlos, how's the fleet looking up? Kiro looked over his shoulder to see Carlos sprawled over the SAT, Situational Awareness table, that was projecting a holographic map of the battlefield being powered by a magical lacrima, cheaper and more reliable for holograms. The picture were mostly red with their fleet colored blue and the enemy green. It's red, there isn't much more to be said about that. The NSA looky here, and the NSA Mincemeat are reporting severe hull damage. They got tag-teamed by the enemy, and their space-time seals were overwhelmed, Carlos reported. The enemy fighters are also wreaking havoc on the cruisers, but switching the QICC, quick impact chakra coils, made it easier to shoot them down. Kiryu frowned before turning eyes to the sector commander of the fighter division, Yumi Yamanaka, who was currently barking orders to her hound fighters engaged in combat with the enemy, through a piece of metal located in her ear, that had Yamanaka's seals inscribed on them, that used the pilot favored telepathic signals, rather than the electronic radio. Tobacco Squadron, Nico Squadron, and Skull Squadron are currently holding the tide of enemy fighters at bay. We've lost at least 6 hounds, while the enemy is losing a steadily growing number of 25. Kiryu raised his eyebrow, not quite believing that assessment. Seeing the look, Yumi clarified, their barriers don't seem to like our lightning rounds all too much. Sir Kiryu made a no face, and nodded his head. What are the Ikra units? Being as large as it was, the Kurama had at least 2 divisions of Ikra personnel, 25-60 soldiers at its disposal, and those very Ikra personnel were currently being transported to the surface of Lao, where they would coordinate with the local police in formulating a proper place of attack, should the enemy, and it was inevitable, break off from the engagement and start landing troops. The Sickle-class corvettes have just reported all Ikra personnel being safely transported to the planet's surface. They also state that most of the civilians have been sent down into the underground bunkers. Kiryu grimaced. He would rather Carlos have said all rather than most. Tell the corvettes to hide behind the moon for now. They're small, and it doesn't seem like the enemy would detect them. That in itself was risky. The corvettes had no room in this type of engagement. In fact, corvettes never had room in this type of engagements. Captain Carlos smiled slightly, and Kiryu could help the chuckle that escaped his lips. The old saying was rarely ever used, but if anything, the fact that it was used now in such an event was simply ironic. Being related to the Namikas, and naturally the Yondaime Hokage, and also to the famed Rakudaime Hokage, who both stood at the face of great odds with fierce determination, that Kiryu was able to stand so still, as another of their rounds impacted against the ship's space-time seals. I was listening to the Mass Effect them while writing this. Oddly, Kiryu wondered whether they had felt the fear he was feeling now, and if so, he wondered why they kept fighting. This fear gnawing away at his heart, the adrenaline crunching through so painfully that it was only due to his blood that he hadn't crumpled to his knees. So how? Then he passed his eyes over his crew, and slowly he began to realize they had to stand, tall, proud, and strong, whether out of confidence, stupidity or will. They simply had to stand, because if not them, then who? So Kiryu had to wonder to himself, who had to stand here? Was it him? So naturally, due to his relation to these 2 heroes. Or was it more? Again he passed eyes through his crew, and then to the ships outside that were valiantly fighting against this enemy of 32 ships, as cruisers' wreckage drifted past him, numbly reading the name of the ship, as Mincemeat. Kiryu realized. No, he wasn't what had to stand so proudly, and neither did the Yondaime nor the Rakudaime. They didn't stand, they guided, they built. It was they alone that made the hero, it was what they had created that made them heroes. And in this very battle, it wasn't he nor his crew that stood as the heroes, the standing proud warriors of old, but it was the very ship that was leading this fight. The Kurama held strong against the enemy blasts, each cacophony of lightning and wind it launched was like the roar of an angry beast in Kiryu's ears. Like the shinobi before, Kiryu was an insect to this beast, just as the heroes of old made their companions feel. In this way, Kiryu knew, if the Kurama would not stand, then who would? It wasn't Kiryu to be the symbol. Kiryu is the one to pick the ship back up when it would be faltering, to lead it onwards when it knew nowhere to go. Kiryu stilled his breath, as this fact caused a jump start to his muscles, and, as if the ship itself was spurred on by the captain, another chakra impact coil was launched, this time laced with wind chakra, and it slammed against the enemy ship like an apocalypse. It pierced through the ship's neck, severing it from existence, as the cruisers began riddling the Kurama with shots. The space-time seals activated, and the thin veil that surrounded the ship lit up like a firecracker, as several barriers began springing up all around the ship, using the veil as power and a basis to emerge. The enemy fire splashed against the barriers, briefly being absorbed before that was rejected by the crystallized chakra core, while it tried to feed the seals, as much chakra needed. 39%. Kiryu barely registered the number, as he ordered his ship to aim for those that looked like carriers. If the space battle was lost, then Kiryu would damn well make sure the ground battle would win. 19%. Kiryu was livid, as he stared at the ships blocking the main cannon of the Kurama, and immediately ordered a calm link established between the lead cruiser. What do you think you're doing? You're blocking the path of the Kurama, get out of the way. Kiryu all but screamed into the communication seal. The Uzumaki was angry, but then he heard the soft ragged breaths on the other end, the coughing and splashing of blood, and Kiryu realized the man on the other end was close to death. This is Senior Naval Officer Takeda Bukov Kafa. If this is the captain of the Kurama, my apologies, sir. But I cannot follow that order, Kitaro was about to retort, but the snow stopped him before he could begin. Sir, we cannot allow the Kurama to fall. It'd lose the morale of the troops if that happened so early in the conflict. And honestly sir, you're our best hope to show this alien themes that we shinobi don't fall easily. The Uzumaki snapped his mouth shut, eyes glaze, as he watched one of the cruisers become engulfed in a fiery explosion, one of the lifeless corpses of a shinobi floating by the Kurama's viewport. The Uzumaki spat, and he noticed how Carlos looked at him worriedly. Calmingly he raised a hand in his direction, and ordered the Kurama to retreat. If the Kurama fell now, it'd only mean worse for the whole shinobi fleet. The Uzumaki glared at the enemy ships, as the last of the colony cruisers began closing in on them. Like rabid animals they tore through 3 enemy ships before one was destroyed, split in half right down the center. The last ship, and the ship Kitaro realized was where Takeda was on board, began putting their engines to full throttle, the ship racing forward, and toward an enemy vessel. In a stunning show of power it crashed straight through the cruiser before the ship seized, and the combined fire from all sides was too much for it to handle. Like another ship before, it exploded in a fiery display before it vanished. The enemy vessels began to close in on the planet, and Kitaro could help but curse, as the planet was left to fend for itself in ground warfare, as the Kurama retreated to lick its wounds. Looking down at one of his pilots, Terminals, Kitaro saw something that only served to make him angrier. In big blocky letters it read, shield strength 9%, hull integrity 68%. Kitaro punched the nearest wall, and cursed. As if it fell Kitaro, and the entire cruise, sorrow the Kurama began to buckle, and let out a wail of despair for fallen comrades, and a lost battle. Kitaro felt an anger bubble in his chest. He wanted to go back, he wanted to slaughter every last one of them. The captain lifted his head, and then looked, as if visibly struck by a bullet. In front of him, on the side wall of the ship was the shinobi motto. A motto made by the great Rakudane, and leader of the 9 guardians himself. It read, endure, heroes are born of sacrifice. Guilt and shame built up in his chest, and complete self-loathing. A hand was placed onto Kitaro's shoulders, and he looked behind him to see Carlos's reassuring face, smiling at him to say stay strong. The Uzumaki turned his head away. Again he wondered, how do those heroes stand so strong? Baker Joan and Lieutenant Surin, Bravo Company. A side effect to their mercenary roots however, when push came to shove they made great politicians. Their stubbornness and evolving views made them quick and easy adapters to the fight of words rather than sword. These aliens who were invading Lao however, got the wrong end of the stick, the very sharp and pointy end of the stick that can mutilate you with one hit. Though mutely she noticed the bodies of several humans littering the battlefield, police officers, and the unlucky Iker. Surin cursed to herself. These aliens were overall weaker than the majority of her troops, but they were well disciplined, and had the advantage of numbers. Look out. The shout was punctuated with an explosion. 3 human soldiers flying up into the air, charred, and some missing limbs. Some metal spheres were being thrown into the air, not randomly she noted. They were in a pattern each in the highest concentration of her soldiers, and each detonating in a deadly blast of fire and heat. Get down. Those things are like exploding tags. The Iker heeded her command, but they weren't so helpless as to give ground to these aliens, simply because of some spherical contraption that went boom. Once a ball was thrown a shinobi was quick to throw it back at the, sometimes even kick, and before they knew it, the aliens found themselves the victim to their very own weapons. Surin raced forward from the wreckage of an exploded police car, Ira rifle raised, and deftly she switched the ammo type to wind rounds, perfect for quick, lethal, and quiet hits. With practiced ease honed from years of fighting she had sighted an alien, and squeezed the trigger. The alien squawked in surprise, as his shields failed, and by the time it had noticed Surin's approach, long blonde hair pulled up into a ponytail, and all black Iker information complete with fingerless gloves, and Kevlar vest, it was already too late. Surin popped 2 shots into his head, the first puncturing through, and the second splattering it. She forced the alien's partner to pull back, but he underestimated the speed of a shinobi. In mere seconds she had closed the gap in between them, and the lieutenant forgot assault rifle, and instead pumped chakra into a seal located on her wrist. By the blink of an eye a tanto was in her hands, and she brought up, intent on gutting the alien, but to her immediate surprise the alien brought its gun up, and blocked the metal blade. The Kiri native grinned, and she expertly pushed the alien back. It started flailing its arm, in order to steady itself from the far more powerful hit than anticipated, and before he was able to react, Surin launched an open palm thrust into his chest, forcing his body back, and colliding with 2 of its buddies, and crushing them against a car. She heard the sounds of bones snapping, and she winced. Ouch, she muttered. The Kiri native looked around her. Many of her shinobi were rushing the aliens. They of course surprised at the sudden change to close quarters were caught off guard, as they were eliminated with ease, though some had actually managed to kill a shinobi or 2. Smirking, as she noticed one of her platoon jonins, the Kumo native named C, had successfully flash-fried 2 aliens using a quick fireball technique. Yeah, this is Delta. Bravo, heads up, you got bombers coming in. Larry Vector half initiative. Haven't seen one of these since I was a barefaced recruit at 15 years of age. These aliens either have outdated flight patterns or are just too confident. Surin had raised an amused eyebrow as she heard the low thrum of jets pushing through the atmosphere. The Lariat Vector was an old bombing pattern where two bombers would head towards each other and drop their payloads, a near copy of Kumo's own Lariat technique. A half initiative just meant that instead of having two opposing bombers fly down, there was only one run. However, this technique quickly went out of style for a reason these aliens were just about to learn. Mamoru, Kelsey, Goru, get up there and take them down. Mamachi, dressed similarly to Surin only with bandages covering his lower mouth and forehead, grunted in response, and the three Ikra personnel climbed up the nearest building. Chakra sticking the soles of their boots to the wall, the three soldiers scaled it in nearly 3 seconds, at the end of which they jumped off the building and latched onto the passing bombers. Surin meanwhile was shaking her head at their mannerisms, but let it slide due in part to their close history together. The Jonin looked around the battlefield and only saw mangled alien corpses and the occasional prisoner being pushed forward by her men. Carefully Surin checked her stone of gel crystal chamber and reset her Ira to its default earth rounds. Gear up, we're moving to the next sector. The shouts of her soldiers were immediate, and already they had begun racing up nearby buildings to follow their orders. Surin smiled. Woking was overrated anyways. In orbit of planet Lao, Turian cruiser. Justice, Captain Focus Region. The captain that had practically motivated this invasion turned slaughter, was lying slumped in his chair, as several panicked cries and hasty requests for evac were being blared through the Turian communications link. The majority of the bridge crew weren't even paying attention, as they tried to quell the fires spawned from overloaded terminals, and ferrying injured crew members to and fro the dot. Sir, engineering teams are reporting mass malfunctions in the Mass Effect core, several hull breaches, and half of the crew are near death. Sir, we need orders. Severus was downright panicking. This was his first situation in such a mess, and though bootcamp instilled discipline and order in any event, the sight that the young Turian had seen just a moment ago had shattered his reasoning. Rally up the medics, and tell them to sweep through the most heavily damaged areas, and deal with the wounded there first. Severus made a shaky salute before disappearing to relay the orders. The captain watched him go before sighing again. Everything was in shambles. His vision of creating a peaceful treaty with the inferior race through a show of military strength, and might it backfired, and instead he had probably loosed a rabid variant on both the Turians and the council species, granted smart variant that could apparently do magic, and break the very fabric of space and time to defend their ships. Focus looked out his window to see the wreckage of the Perseverance suddenly float by his ship. The entire dreadnought had been bisected, and more than 80% of the crew was dead, most having been killed by the electric shock that happened right after the coil had impacted against the ship's hull. Focus wondered if this were their tactics. Eliminating the crew rather than the ship itself. He would admit it was bloody genius. The entire thing would probably revolutionize naval warfare, but a bitter taste filled his mouth when he remembered that the same very tactic was being used against them. The remaining 18 Turian ships, 7 cruisers, and 11 frigates, were practically limping now, most of their crew injured or dead, and the legions of the Turian hierarchy were battling it out with the alien ground forces in what Focus estimated was a massacre. All the Turians were putting up a good fight, but in the end the aliens had superior weapons and superior abilities. For every one soldier they killed, a serpent made of water would appear out of nowhere and kill 50. This is Dizola's Arterius leading the 13th Legion. We have met heavy ground forces and are being pushed back to the landing zone, requesting immediate aerial assistance. I repeat, we are ARG. They're right on top of us. Focus didn't pay the transmission any heed. Similar calls were being made by other legions, and, as much as they wanted, the cruisers couldn't afford to launch any more salvos. Indeed, when they launched the first bombardment to clear the landing zone, 2 cruisers had literally fallen apart from the stress. Focus turned to the bridge, seeing as how he was alone now with nothing but the fires to keep him company, but something was off in the air. The Turian felt this. Quietly he pushed himself off his captain chair and turned around to the open door leading toward the main compartment of the Turian vessel. Severus. Anyone, Focus yelled. All he got for his efforts were echoes. Echoes. Why the hell are there echoes? Cautiously Faku removed his pistol from his waist and moved towards the hallway. Raptor-like eyes watching every corner like a hunter scouting a wild beast. Navigator. Helmsman. He yelled. The ship was silent. The echo of his own voice was his only answer and only solace. The Turian turned down a corner, and immediately the stench of blood slammed against his nostrils. The Turian's mandibles flared in abject horror as a pile of bloody Turians sat at the end of the room, each dripping blood from a cut through their throat or spine. But they weren't tossed onto the ground randomly. No, they were placed methodically, as if the person who did it wanted some sort of image shown from it, but otherwise the captain couldn't see what. But he would never really see it when suddenly he felt a sharp pain to the back of his neck, followed by several small stabs to his spinal column. Planet Lao, 13th Legion, Izola's Arterius. Arterius's mission had been simple. Evaluate the technological state of the alien species, and to confirm any points of interest, advanced technology, Prothean ruins, the works. But Arterius soared. If he made it out of this alive, he would write a 300-detailed report on everything valuable on this spear's forsaken hellhole, which could be summarized in a few short sentences. What in the name of Krogan fucking Spears thinking? The elite of the Turian ranks, survivor of near-suicidal skirmishes, and a soon-to-be Spectre candidate, the Turian, was practically turned into a mess of shrieks, cries, and whimpers. These aliens were goddamn magicians. Even as he ran through the dense forests that surrounded the metropolitan city, he found several of his men being sucked down into the earth by gaping maws, and a water serpent rising out of the air and crashing down on his soldiers, killing a few outright by the impact, and drowning the rest. Keep moving. We have to get to the evac site. Dezola roared. The Turians were more than glad to follow that order, very few stopping, but to try and delay the aliens by putting some well-placed shots. Izola's huffed to himself as he rose over a peak of dirt and earth before rolling to a stop. The few surviving men of the Legion began forming up around him. They were at the evac site now. If the shuttle would arrive, it would be the world to Dezola's. The Turians all took cover behind some rocks or trees. One of them actually managed to dig a trench big enough to hide him if he went prone. But Dezola's was hanging out into the open, waiting, watching. He should have added not blinking to that list, as right when he had closed his eyes, a nanosecond later, he found a fist in his face. Arterius was thrown across the air like a ragdoll before slamming against a tree, a part of his head fracturing from the extreme hit. The Turian still had the strength to stand up though, and he tried, but not before watching, as his men were butchered left and right. A group of the aliens, a team of 3, were rolling behind cover, as the Turians laid down suppressing fire on them. One of the newer recruits tossed a grenade, but the action proved fruitless. One of the aliens jumped out, and used its gun, as a type of weapon to redirect it towards the Turians. 2 Turians were killed in the blast. One of the Turians found himself locked in a deadly game of hand-to-hand with one of the aliens. The alien brought its arm forward with a right hook, but the Turian dodged, and gripped the outstretched hand of the enemy. With the strength of a military man, he pulled the alien forward, and kneed him in the chest. The alien gasped, and the Turian didn't give him time to breath, as he slammed the back of his gun onto the back of the alien's neck. A snap of bones was heard, and the alien fell lifelessly to the floor. One of the aliens had died so far. One of the Turian pulled out a shotgun from his back, and when the alien was close enough he fired. Dezolas had to raise a mandible. Either the alien hadn't seen a shotgun before, or he was just cocky, he didn't know. The alien simply turned thinking the widespread shrapnel would pass him, but instead he found metal clanking against his shields, not enough to drop it, but enough that it caused the alien to stumble, giving the Turian enough time to trim its legs, and point the barrel of the shotgun in its face, pulverizing the enemy's head in bits and pieces of gore. One of the aliens stared at the death of his 2 comrades, and was gawking at the Turians in shock and disbelief before anger soon set in. Dezolas felt dread rise in his gut, as the alien formed those hand signals that precluded one of their magic abilities, slicing them cleanly into tiny bits and pieces, and killing them in the most gruesome way Dezolas had ever seen. Not even Krogan were this bloody. When the cyclone disappeared, Dezolas was horrified to see Turian blood and gore littering the ground in front of him. Dezolas looked up, startled, as the alien that was formerly a few feet away was now suddenly right in front of him. The Turian tried to raise its assault rifle, but instead found a knife in his gut, though not lethal, and it glared to his face. The alien spoke, but he couldn't understand his language. "Don't worry, where you're going you'll be wishing for death." The alien then headbutted him, the force so strong that it could have cracked open his skull, and Arterius was knocked into blissful unconsciousness. All across the planet Turians were fighting, and dying. The ground battle of Lao would forever be remembered in Turian history, as a massacre that could have completely overruled the Krogan, as the dominating race in terms of power. For all intents and purposes the Nine were a separate entity to the Shinobi Council. However, the Nine held strong political and military power, so eventually the seated cage of the Shinobi Alliance had to inform them of the situation. In doing so most people would expect an outrage from the Nine, but Anna knew otherwise. The Nine were still and quiet, as they reclined comfortably against their chairs. The room she was sitting in was largely dominated by an oval table where the whole Shinobi Council, and then some could sit with enough arm space to just swing them around. The room was splashed with different colors, each representing one of the 9 Bijuu with the original members of the 9, the ones who became their new hosts after the war had ended. The 9 had no leader, but if anyone were to really guess it'd be the holder of the Kyubi, considering the Bijuu themselves chose their Jinchuriki now, and considering the fact that the now current Kyubi Jinchuriki was the first ever since the death of the Rakudane Hokage spoke volumes of the man he is. The current Kyubi container was a man named Takashi Saika, a brown-haired male who had been known in Konoha City as a former member of the Ghost Mercenary Group, a cunning and ruthless individual. It was no wonder why they chose him as his next container after more than a century of guarding Konoha in its Kyubi form. All around the table were the 9 members themselves, each being the Jinchuriki to one of the tailed beasts themselves. This is a very pressing concern. The peace achieved after the colonial war had been shaky from the beginning. But if this new conflict has anything to say, we may have a problem with the civilian sector. The Jinchuriki of the Nipi, Asuna, was shaking her head as she thought of the ramifications. The brown-haired female turned to the pseudo-leader of the Nine, only to see him deep in thought, most likely conversing with his tenant. The situation is indeed dire, and there is the possibility of the colony fleet being pushed back, even with the assistance of the Kurama Ana reported. Minutely she noticed the Kyubi Jinchuriki smile amusedly. This was the only thing she hated about talking with him. He was always chatting with the fox, and she didn't know what was being said. While this is indeed troubling, we ourselves are in no position to be of assistance. Stability has already been disrupted through the inner colonies, and the multitude of mercenary groups popping up is doing nothing to quell the sudden growth of violence in the outer colonies. The Jinchuriki of the Sanbi said, a man named Selk. Before Anne could speak up, the silent hall was attacked with uproarious laughter, as Takashi began laughing into the air. Those pansy mercogs won't last a week. He laughed. Anna frowned at the male, while the other members just nursed their headaches from his outburst. The current cage realized that this was a regular occurrence for them. And what makes you so sure? Gari, the Chibi Jinchuriki asked, that the Nine were becoming stagnant. That was until Kyubi had chosen a new host, a similarly headstrong individual with a shady history. Mercenary work, extortions, black market dealings. The man had been at the very top of the most wanted list when he had been chosen, and it had led to an uproar of the community, not to mention within the ranks of the Nine themselves. Having the ninth and final position being filled with a person such as Anna, and the council knew, would lead to changes, and whether the Nine were ready or not wasn't up to them. They have always been a second priority. They have no organization or development. Just give the Navy a month, a week for Anbu. And these guys will be gone without so much as a whisper, Takashi declared. The silence in the hall was suffocating. Takashi, however, seemed unaffected, even oblivious to it. Even if what you say holds merit, Takashi, there is no arguing that they still have caused uncountable amounts of damage in the outer colonies, Cell countered. Takashi shrugged his shoulders uncaringly. You give a kid a gun, and he'll do some damage before you stop him. The Nine were none too pleased with that answer, and many seemed ready to start yelling before the timely intervention of Asuna. Well then, Takashi, what do you believe our course of action should be? Takashi turned to Asuna, an amused smile on his face, as he humored her. Like I said, the mercenaries are no cause of concern. Hell, we could probably send them in to deal with these aliens, and hope they end up killing each other. The other members frowned at this, but these aliens are a whole different situation. An unprovoked attack, and not only that, but they've taken shinobi lives. Our people aren't as forgiving as we believe them to be. The Nine passed eyes at each other before turning to Takashi. Publicize the incident that happened between the R&D fleet and the colony itself. Civilian support will most likely be instantaneous, and then we will send our fleet to take one of their colonies, Takashi said calmly. There was an immediate reaction by the 9 members, all of them rising to their feet to have a shouting contest. The only ones not standing up were Asuna, Anna, and Takashi himself. He was calm even in the face of accusations such as "You're a warmonger," or "We are the shepherds of peace, not chaos." They yelled and preached. Takashi was pinching the bridge of his nose in annoyance. Enough. His voice was loud, louder than any other man or woman speaking her mind in the room, and he was angry. Takashi had experience dealing with unruly subordinates, and to him the 9 were the unruliest of them all. If it were up to him, he'd gun them all down, but the Biju were picky about their hosts. I'm not going to dignify any of you with a response. Takashi roared, rightly so, for even with their loud arguments, Takashi knew they agreed with him. The shinobi and all her allies were bred for war. That was their birthright, and the shinobi have proved it time and time again. It was standard for elemental country natives to join the Academy of Ninjutsu at the age 8, a tradition slightly followed by their allies, and to be trained how to fight and utilize chakra before graduating at the age of 15, and from there you would decide whether to continue a military career or join the civilian infrastructure. Most chose the military, while those who joined the civilian infrastructure might as well be in the military. Everybody knew how to fight, everybody knew how to kill. The divide between civilian and soldier was if they were getting paid to kill or not. Every member of the 9 knew this. They knew war would be the only option their people would see following publication of the attack, and withholding it would only lead to another rebellion. Takashi's answer was, for the most part, a solution. Cage, with the infinite wisdom of the 9 guardians, I advise to retaliate against the aliens. Defending our colony is one thing. We need to show these aliens that we are willing and able to beat them down. With our fists splitted, sour looks passed through the members present as they heard this, but we also need to show them that we aren't mindless apes who only know how to shoot a gun. They'll know the might of the shinobi soon enough. Anna remained silent as she exited the Guardian Council chambers, excusing herself politely and passing several service guards stationed outside the chamber doors. As she walked on, it truly wondered how much the shinobi changed, and how much they stayed the same. Turian-controlled space. Validia. Saeed glared at the 2 alien soldiers standing there, an angry grimace on his face, as he tried to stifle the itch his cuffed wrists were experiencing. The aliens had subjected him to pitiful levels of interrogations. It was as if electrocution and psychological isolation was all they could think of. Zaid was an Anbu operative, assigned on board an Anbu cruiser, tasked with providing support to an R&D fleet. He was iffy on the details, but he knew enough, and by the fact that he was held prisoner in a quaint holding cell, Zaid knew it was time for war to come calling. The young male grinned to himself, for an Anbu being a prisoner was the greatest thing an enemy could do to you. He skulled his face, however, when the door to his cell opened, and the male slacked into his chair, looking mildly bored at everything. The alien stood a few scant meters away from him, and Zaid was pleased to see a type of bandage around the alien's arm, a gift Zaid had bestowed on him. The alien growled, and made a bunch of squawking sounds. The alien pointed at himself, and made two separate squawks, the first note being higher pitched, and the second somewhere near where Do would be. Zaid didn't know the various notes of music, as well as he actually cared. The alien continued to squawk its strange language again, and Zaid looked at him, as if he was crazy. Did it honestly believe he would repeat after him? Sorry crow face, but I ain't a fucking bird. The alien looked confused, and Zaid hardly resisted the idea to laugh into the air. Zaid's efforts, however, were rewarded with a punch to the face. Zaid shook his head, and turned to the alien, its mandibles spread open in anger. The human raised an eyebrow, daring him to continue, and he did. He pounded on his chest, harder and harder, but each time he did, he got closer and closer before in a flash, Zaid had headbutted the alien in the chest. The full force of it was enough to push his chair forward, and the Anbu operative found himself falling forward, and onto the Turian. A series of squawks later, two alien guards stormed into the doorway, and grabbed his chair, flinging it back, and causing Zaid to hit it painfully. The previous aliens stood up, and glared at Zaid, to which the Anbu operative merely grinned at before both the alien and the guards stormed out. Zaid's grin stayed put, as he fished something out of his mouth. It was a chip, no longer than his index finger, and Zaid was staring at an insertion point located on his handcuffs. Well, thanks crowface. Zaid grinned before sliding the piece in, and rounding it inside the lock. The handcuffs clacked onto the ground, and the Anbu operative promptly vanished into the shadows. Now the fun began. Planet Lao, Platoon Jonan C, Ikra Bravo Company, 2nd Platoon. C ducked into an open room fast enough to avoid a barrage of bullets. The man behind him hadn't been as lucky. His chakra shields flared for a moment before they failed, and the metal projectiles slammed into his body. The shinobi was knocked back into the ground, dead. The 2nd Platoon gritted their teeth as they engaged the aliens in a fierce indoor battle. C had learned the hard way that the aliens were easy pickings in an open field. Their discipline and tactics held true against his shinobi. The close quarters would have allowed the shinobi better use of that is if they didn't get shot first. As it was, the aliens were hanging in several sections of the building, each section only having one corridor where his shinobi were being funneled into for easy pickings. His men were forced to split up, and their low numbers meant they couldn't just bull rush the enemy. One of the alien's strange ball devices rolled into his view, and C's eyes flashed in fear. Get down. A bomb resounded over the small room, and C felt his shields crack before he was thrown into the side of a wall. The shinobi under his command cried out in alarm, as their commanding officer slid down the wall with a thud. One Chunin broke off with assistance from his squad to check on him. Platoon Jonan C? Chunin asked. It took a moment, but C replied with a groggy groan. Chunin's face immediately lit up into relieved expression, as C brought his gun up, and it began pulsing with chakra. What's the enemy doing? C asked. Chunin straightened his face, and nodded. They're still hunkered down the hallway, and we can't do much against them. Sir. We need orders. C acknowledged him, and straightened himself, that is until another explosion riddled the building. C dropped right back down into a crouch, and Jonan saw one or two bodies flying outside the room he was in. C immediately slid into cover, and peered down the hallway. The aliens were now pushing forward, and had little options. Get the men ready, if they push any more we'd be forced out of the building. The Chunin nodded, and the shinobis were rallied with a single call. Move it. C hissed. The shinobi obliged, and sprang out of cover, their guns flaring with lightning rounds, and wind rounds. The aliens' advance halted, the shinobi pushed forward, though not without casualties. 3 shinobi's shields had been gutted, and before they could get into cover their bodies had been littered with holes. Tags out with them 2 shinobi at the front pulled out an exploding tag each, both of them were pasted on a thin piece of metal. A small surge of chakra later, and at the front of each piece a long blade popped out not unlike a standard kunai. The shinobi threw them forward, and they both found purchase, one against a wall, and another embedded deep into one of the aliens. The resulting explosions were devastating. The aliens who had discarded the small pieces of metal as inconsequential, found themselves amidst a fiery blaze, as fire and explosions riddled the group of soldiers. Their momentary stun allowed C to push forward with his men, and quickly they had eliminated them. Check the rooms, make sure none are left. C ordered. The remaining shinobi, which C was dismayed to see were only 5, nodded, and set to work, while C silently mourned the loss of lives. Several calls rang out from his radio seal, all of which were affirmatives from the teams he sent out to deal with the rest of the forces inside the building. Casualties were overwhelming, and C knew that 2nd Platoon was gonna have to get used to new faces. This is 2nd Platoon to Bravo Command. The last pocket of resistance on 1st Street had been dealt with, C reported. There was brief static before he got a reply. Good work, C. Good news from the higher-ups. 3rd Fleets are already here, and cleaning house on top. The familiar voice of Surin eased C's tension, more so than the good news did. Saddle up, C. With the loss of their fleet, the aliens began running off into the forests. We'll have to deal with them. Sensors are being offloaded from the reinforcements, so you don't have to worry about any extra work. C acknowledged her, and sighed before dropping the transmission. The male turned to one of the alien weapons, and picked it up. Asymmetrical warfare was something the shinobi excelled in. Enemies were always stronger than you, better than you, or outnumbered you, so shinobi had studied the principle of evolution. They thrived off of a challenge, and what these aliens lack in the shinobi aspect, they excelled on their own, and C knew only the shinobi would truly benefit from this war. Because in the end the shinobi thrive in war. Codex. Colonial Rebellion. The Colonial Rebellion was a bloody 5-year conflict consisting of 23 of the outer colonies, rebelling against the main 10 inner colonies. The fighting was caused due to colonists wanting to claim sovereignty from the United Shinobi government. The Shinobi government had originally not perceived the rebellion as a threat, however, when several major population centers began exploding into fiery carcasses, while ships started disappearing off their planned patrol routes. The NSA sent a battle group to deal with the outer colonies, but fierce hit and run tactics had left them severely crippled from continuing. For a year after that, the USG and the rebels were merely biding time before, in bold and terrifying strategy, the rebels invaded one of the inner worlds, using a fleet of captured ships and their own small fleets. The NSA reacted accordingly. The rebels proved to be a far more deadly foe, when willing to use every means of victory, and were undaunted with civilian casualties. This, however, got no sympathy from the NSA, and most POWs found themselves placed in the harshest conditions a shinobi could fathom. This long-divided hatred continued to spread between the inner and outer colonies, as the war dragged on before it finally ended with a devastating strike against the rebels' main base of Mindwar. To this day, animosity between inner colony members and outer colony members existed, especially with the methods the outer colonies employed. While the outer colonies were now on a tighter leash, though with the passing of the Colonial Act, they were allowed to govern themselves and their people how they saw fit, an illusion of sovereignty for them, but nonetheless was welcomed all the same. Codex. NSA. The Navy of the Shinobi Alliance, better known as the NSA, is the military arm of the Shinobi expansion. The military is largely dominated with large space-capable ships due in part to their use in space combat. The NSA is different from most military organizations in the fact that it is a separate entity from the USG, and that their members are part of the governing body. In this case, the NSA is as much political as it is military. The NSA's main task is exploration, defense, and research. The NSA has several branches, some culminating in the independent fleets of special forces, or were listed civilian in nature. This is the result of the large amount of funding the NSA received upon its creation, and continued funding, as it endeavored to the stars. Codex. Service Guards. The Service Guards are a group of soldiers devoted to the Guardians of the Nine. The Service Guards isn't a voluntary force. Their members are handpicked from the several branches of the NSA and the AFSA, most being from Special Forces branches. The Service Guards are respected as an elite squad capable of any mission due in part to their mixed members. The Service Guard act as both the bodyguards of the Nine, as well as a ceremonial group for most shinobi events. Upon introduction of the Service Guards, new members are given a silver beret with the kanji of the Biju crossed by two kunai. This beret represents the Service Guard's position in the shinobi world, and most deem it an honor to wear them. Rear Admiral Tuchi Senju rubbed his chin in deep thought, as he sat on the command chair of the NSA Tears of Regret, the flagship of the First Royal Fleet. The Tears of Regret was a battlecruiser, similar in size to a dreadnought, but held enough guns to wage a small war on its own. His fleet of 54 ships had 4 battlecruisers, 5 dreadnought, 30 cruisers, and 15 frigates. Tucci was contemplating his next choices, as reports came in from both ground-side forces and naval forces. The losses on the ground were acceptable, and the planet had been retaken, with the few concentrated resistance the aliens could pull up were destroyed instantly. Tucci halted his line of thoughts, as he forgot the proper name for the aliens, Turians. After an Anbu operative had appeared out of nowhere, and dropped a living alien on his doorstep, as well as another surviving Turian from the planet Lao, Tucci wasted no time in ordering Tiandai to deal with the two. The results had been startling, but the Yamanaka still had much they wanted to sift through in the alien heads, but they got what Tucci was most interested in. Information. The shinobi now knew how their enemy operated, how they thought, their government, and their people. In Tucci's eyes they were completely alien to the shinobi, but they shared a common trait: they were a militaristic regime. Tucci could connect the dots between the sudden attack on Captain Rentero's fleet, and he suspected that their militarism paranoia had kicked in, and elimination of unknown threats became prevalent over peaceful encounters. As a military man, Tucci respected them, but from a civilian standpoint, he had little to actually stop him from outright hating the aliens. But his hate was nothing compared to the reaction actual civilians had. They were practically bloodthirsty. So far as Tucci knew about these Turians, he found little reason to feel guilty, as he would no doubt be leading his fleet to war soon. Sir, a transport ring has been built onto the surface of Lao. Tucci turned to his Zo, Captain Deller, the son of an elemental country's native, and a Western native, reported. Tucci gave his thanks, as he brought the reports up on the holo projection. The transport ring was a large ring dominated by the Horatian formula. The ring was used mostly to transport supplies and personnel between planets, acting much like the ground equivalent of FTL. Send a message to the homeworld, tell them to send supplies immediately. We'll have to deal with the damage soon enough, Tucci said calmly. The naval officers nodded their heads, and many moved quickly to send the transmission. Sir, the NSA Karama has returned from their scouting mission. The captain reports no enemy units so far. Tucci nodded his head, and keyed several commands onto his armrest. Almost immediately the Karama took a position next to the Tears of Regrets, and waited patiently, like a lion waiting for the foolish hunter to come into his abode. Tucci eyed it passingly before returning to his work. His mission was simple: secure Lao, eliminate the alien threat, and then, like the old saying, an eye for an eye, he'd take one of the alien colonies. Just that they didn't know where that colony was. Oh, the aliens they captured knew where it was, but the exact coordinates. Their own mapping system seemed to incorporate these mass relays, and considering what had happened to the R&D fleet, Tucci wasn't up to sending his fleet through it. Right now the Yamanakas raiding the alien mines were trying to find any star charts or the like they could use, but the process was slow going. These aliens' minds stored memory differently than how human did. Sir? The rear admiral of the first fleet turned to the ensign that called for him calmly, appearing every bit the calm and collected person an admiral should be. We've just received a signal from an Anbu operative located at the Gamma Quadrant, sir. Tucci raised an eyebrow. The Gamma Quadrant was a ways away from Shinobi-controlled space. What was Anbu doing there? Patch it through, Tucci ordered. The ensign nodded, as he pressed several rounds before the scratchy voice of an Anbu operative came through. This is Anbu operative designation Sentinel to any NSA ships. Please respond. Authorization code, C231 to 432 to 759. Over. Tucci quickly replied, hands typing away commands onto his armrest for the fleet to ready itself. Sentinel, this is Rear Admiral Tucci of the Royal First Fleet, responding to you in orbit of the planet Lao. Please state your business. Tucci waited patiently, as a pause was made before the voice spoke again. Rear Admiral, sir, I request immediate assistance to my location, sir. For what purpose? For an invasion, sir. In orbit of Galidia. The world of Galidia wasn't very interesting. Besides the fact that the planet provided many rich minerals and metal mining to help feed the Turian economy and war machine, it does not change the fact that the planet itself did not give the hierarchy anything more from what it already had, and so the planet itself held very little defenses. The only ships defending it were a token force of cruisers. So that was why when a fleet of warships appeared over the colony world, was the fleet horribly outgunned. That was why when the enemy warships opened fire, that the fleet found itself nothing but chunks of metal in space. So that was why the few armed soldiers on the planet found themselves slaughtered by heavy orbital bombardments and enemy ground forces, and so that's why Galidia had fallen to the Shinobi Alliance. Citadel-controlled space. Citadel, the Council of Citadel Space, collectively known as the Big Three, were silent as they watched the recording of one of the Turian soldiers on Galeria, as they fought against the Asari-like soldiers storming their shambles of a base. They watched, silently, in morbid horror when the Turian soldiers found himself frozen, and his very own shadow reached up to strangle him before he fell over, dead. The councillors were frozen in shock, as the aliens rampaged through the Turian lines that should be unbreakable, unflinching. But yet those very same lines were torn to disarray, as troops tried to last as long as they could while others were left dead or dying on the ground. When the camera of the already dead Turian cut off abruptly, from what the councillors could tell was a boot to the face, did they regain their wit to properly understand what had happened? Care to explain, Spiritus? Tivos asked. The Solarian councillor, all manner, was taking the news better than the other two. Most definitely STG had informed him of the colony being besieged, though he was still shaking. Obviously the STG did not inform him of the technology these aliens possessed. I am learning, Tivos. Spiritus said defensively. They have just given me the details regarding the aliens' race. I'm sending the information now. The two of the councillors brought their Omni tools up and read through the information. Tivos especially was unpleasant. You attacked a new spacefaring race, she accused. Spiritus spread his mandibles open, obviously disbelieving in the fact that she focused on that, rather than what they were doing to the colony. They had activated an inactive mass relay which is against Citadel law. We were merely upholding our responsibilities, as the police force of the galaxy, Spiritus declared. Tivos didn't seem convinced. Perhaps we should revise the act considering the inactive relays. Redetermine proper protocols in light of. Agal took a deep breath as he turned back to the recording. Recent events. Yes, perhaps we should. Tivos agreed, though she was still glaring at Spiritus. The Turian was sweating a bit, the fear of him losing his position and being remembered in history as the one who had been in power during a diplomatic scandal was disconcerting to say the least. These aliens possess technology unheard of by Citadel races, Tivos admitted, as she read reports on these aliens, who had made a fierce counterattack against the Turians. It says here from the initial report that these new species do not use Ezo as a power source. The Gaul's eyes took on a certain gleam, as he, as well, stumbled upon the report, his mind reeling at the scientific possibilities. What are their weapons? Their shield system and FTL capabilities? Agal asked. Spiritus bowed his head in apology, and Agal realized that the Turians probably didn't know any more than they did, which was surprising given the Solarians' passive spying on all other races. Though the STGT Mongolia had to escape due to the massive war fleet in orbit, we should send an emissary immediately to ease tensions between the two. No? Spiritus yelled. Are you a mad woman? We'd appear weak compared to these creatures. It'd create instability in Citadel space if this were to happen. Spiritus argued. Tivos looked like she was about to argue, but then again spoke up. He's right, Tivos. The political backlash from this won't only affect the Turians, but also the Citadel. People will begin to question our authority if this continues. Tivos turned to Agal, her eyes wide in shock. Well, you can't seriously be meaning we go to war. Turning to her, he seemed grim as he responded. Only option, peace, would lead to questions. Aliens just took a Turian homeworld. Turian hatred pronounced. Many would not be pleased. Peace. Civil war at best, our heads at worst. No. War for only now. Quell the new species before they could properly affect us. Tivos was gaping as she stared at her two colleagues. You'd make us look like antagonists, she rebuked. All shook his head, and Spiritus was just quiet as his counterpart spoke for him. Probable. The thought has reached my mind. However, the new species are proving a threat, and through the small glimpse of their technology, they are quite formidable. Turian acted on responsibility. New species attacked Turian colony. Citadel forces united to help defend their allies. Though may not get on new species' good graces, we will only further our own status in Citadel space. Tivos was biting the inside of her cheek. Though she saw where Agal was speaking from, she could not risk the Asari republics by dragging them into this war and backfiring. However, if the Turians won, then the Asaris would lose face. Think about the technology they could offer. These are less powered engines and weapons. When they join the Citadel, they would be forced to share their technology with the galactic community, lest they lose face any more than they will after the war. Spiritus spoke up this time, with Agal silently agreeing. Tivos rubbed her head as a headache found its way on her face. The only redeeming part of this was that all seemed less than pleased with his logical thinking, and Spiritus just looked tired. No doubt the Primarches were collectively chewing each other out on losing Galeria. All in favor? Spiritus asked. As when the three counselors brought their hands up, two of them sure that they could bring this new species down a peg, and then establish peaceful relations by subjugation into the Citadel ranks. The Solarians will get new technology, the Turians will maintain their responsibility, and the Asari can smooth out edges in their beginning relationship with the new species. While the galaxy would see the strength of a united Citadel Council. A win-win situation. Sadly, they were basing this on their hundreds of years of dominance in the galaxy. Their complacency at being at the top of the food chain had dulled their wits, and thus deluded them into thinking they were the alpha. But they would soon learn that the people of the shinobi had fought against gods and demons, and had emerged not only as strong and mighty victors, but continuously growing their own power. They were no longer alpha, merely ants to the giants. In orbit of Galedia, Rear Admiral Tucci, and SA tears of regret. Tucci was pleased. The colony that they had jumped into was lightly guarded, and thus the shinobi had suffered no casualties in eliminating local resistance, though the colonists were banding together and forming a militia of sorts to combat the invading shinobi. Tucci wasn't all too worried. Shinobi civilians never really sat still when somebody was taking their homes, and that happened more often than not, so his men were more than equipped to deal with the upset colonists. Rear Admiral Tucci. All ground units reporting green on all objectives. The majority of the population has taken up arms against our forces, however they provide minimal threat to the ground forces, Captain Della reported. Tucci nodded. It is so, pleased with the recent events. He knew the taking of the Turian colony was a declaration of war, and despite himself, Tucci felt a small surge of excitement before it was quelled by a heavy hand. Sir, we just received new orders. Tucci blinked and turned to the ensign. Right. Yamanaka seals are really the work of magic. Patch it through. What Tucci expected to see was Vice Admiral Sato Nara standing there, but instead, to the grizzled veteran shock, the person who stood was not the ornately dressed Vice Admiral, but rather a gruff-looking brown-haired male, dressed neatly in a bleach-white uniform with gray stripes outlining the outfit. But the stark difference of uniforms wasn't what caught his attention. It was the insignia on the man's left arm, a nine-tailed fox having its large gaping maw over a ball of purple chakra. The insignia for the ninth and most powerful member in the Guardian Nine. Rear Admiral Tucci, a pleasure to meet you, Takashi began. I hope you don't mind, but I will be arriving to your coordinates shortly. 2 days at the shortest, give or take a couple of hours. Tucci blinked, more at the fact that he was talking to a member of the Nine, than that he was going to be in the same system as them. Of course not, Saika-san, the Rear Admiral replied. A sour look passed through the ninth member's face before it smoothed out. Good, if I may, sir. Tucci waited for a confirmation, and a slight nod of Takashi's head gave him that. Is there a reason as to why you will be accompanying us? A twinkle entered Takashi's eyes, as he cupped up his chin, a slow smile on his face that unnerved Tucci. You know, Rear Admiral, in my time I have learned many things. How to be a soldier, a mechanic, a horrible boyfriend, and so many more, but you know what is the one thing I learned in my years, that has never failed me before? Tucci leaned forward, and he saw some of his men doing the same. Takashi smiled ruefully at their reactions. That one thing was learning how to be a stubborn asshole. Codex Anbu. The Anbu are the most elite of the AFSA, armed forces of the Shinobi Alliance, and are trained for a myriad of operations. Though they maintain their roots as a covert and espionage outfit, the Anbu are now a fully independent force from the AFSA, however, hold close ties to the T&I division, given their primary directives. Following spaceflight, the heads of Anbu had established a separate division of Anbu called the Storm that acts as the Anbu's fleet, maintains ships, and mans deep space quiet stations. Anbu operatives, and likewise their Storm counterparts, are expected to make a blood oath to not divulge any information, critical or otherwise, to an enemy in an event of capture, and indeed most Anbu are trained to be completely resistant to torture, and would rather kill themselves than allow Yamanaka to enter their brain. In this case, all Anbu operatives are widely regarded as the best of the best, and like their namesake were a shadow threat that made even the greatest of tyrants wary. There has been great controversy regarding Anbu training methods, as a new recruit had a 25.5% chance to die during their first week, with a steadily increasing percentile as their training continues. Though Anbu trainers tried their best to limit the in-training deaths, it does not change the fact that on average, only 15% of new recruits ever survive their training to become fully fledged Anbu operatives. Though questionable, arguably, their operatives are the fiercest shinobi. It is popularly discussed by conspiracy theorists that the harsh training was a way to limit the number of Anbu operatives, as many of the Shinobi Alliance would agree. If by any chance Anbu would go rogue, there would be uncountable losses to the Alliance, before they could even fire off a shot. Ladanya typed away a few commands onto her Omni tool. Going over the 60 ships under her command, she frowned slightly. She could hardly see the need for such a large force in exterminating this new galactic player. Her opinion on Turians weren't as high as that of her own species. However, being the one in charge of the Citadel fleet, she had grown to respect Turian professionalism, and it was her honest opinion that the only reason they had lost Galidia was due to how lightly defended the colony was. Surely an Ezo-less race couldn't be that powerful. They probably didn't have biotics either. Ladanya saw this all as a waste of time. The Turians should be able to handle it on their own, and the new race would either be brought into the Citadel or shunned from Citadel space like the Quarians. Matriarch, we are closing in on the solar system. Ladanya gave the Asari equivalent of a nod before standing up and turning to her communications officer. Contact the Turians and Solarians, they know what to do. The comm officers nodded and keyed in the respective races. The council had left specific instructions that the fleet would open communications with the aliens together, showing a unified front in hopes to get the new aliens to back down without bloodshed. When the ship suddenly dropped into the solar system, quite a ways away from the colony planet of Galicia, Ladanya's orders were quick and calm, full burn towards the colony. The helmsman nodded, and the Destiny Ascension moved forward, its escorts of cruisers keeping close to her, as the fleet followed. Ladanya stood calmly as the ships neared the colony world, no doubt waiting for the new species to move forward and meet the Citadel fleet with their own warships. But, as she neared the colony, she noticed the ships that were blockading the planet and couldn't help but raise the Asari equivalent to an eyebrow. They were numerous, but she counted only 36. She couldn't quite tell what class they were, but she would have guessed the ship in the center formation would be a dreadnought, maybe a little bit bigger than an average one. However, as the Destiny closed in, she felt her eyes whiten slightly, as the ship continued to grow, nearly matching the Destiny Ascension. But her jaw fell when the fleet stood a few kilometers away from the alien fleet, and she could see, as clear, as day, the behemoth that was standing in front of her. Suddenly she didn't know what her odds were, as she watched the monstrosity of military design. Open channels. Scan through every standard and non-standard radio frequencies. They nodded, as she worked diligently, ignoring the shocked mumblings of her colleagues. Almost immediately a hollow projection of an Asari-like person manifested itself in front of her, while the projections of her Turian and Solarian colleagues appeared next to her. The creature that stood in front of her was strange-looking. It had a patch of brown fur on its head, and one pair of eyes much like that of Indot. It was dressed in some official uniform, white with grey outlines, and she herself was dazzled at its ornate style. Comparing the creature's bulky frame to that of an which was collectively agreed upon being feminine, she deduced the creature was male. "I am Takashi Saiko, please state your business." Ladanya blinked, surprised that she had understood him before she reverted back to her professional stance. "I am Matriarch Ladanya of the Asari Republics. Next to me are my colleagues, the Turian Admiral Marvis Vicarian of the Turian Hierarchy, and the Solarian STG Captain Torin Vilbani of the Solarian Union. We are part of the Citadel fleet responding to your invasion of the Turian colony Galedia. To the creature's credit, he didn't seem at all fazed with the two new species that he would have surely never seen before, and instead remained stony face, albeit with a slight quirk of his lips. "By order of the Citadel Council Takashi Saika, you and your fleet are to stand down and relinquish control of the Turian colony world, and be subjugated to Citadel Law." Ladanya ordered with as much authority as she could muster. The alien male blinked, and Ladanya was struck at how sorry-like it was. For a few scant minutes only silence filled Ladanya's bridge, as she waited patiently for a reply. At the corner of her eyes she noticed both Marvis and Torin awkwardly fiddled with their respective uniforms. The alien was cupping its chin, looking thoughtfully up at whatever that was above him. Ladanya was sure the male was just playing them, baiting them to any type of reaction for him to use, but Ladanya would not give him what he wanted, and she was sure her colleagues would not, as well. "The Shinobi Alliance," he finally began, his voice an odd chipper tone, "do not know this Citadel Council, nor is it in any way attached to this government. As such we do not answer to them, and thus you carry no recognized authority here." The way he said recognized sounded sinister to Ladanya, and the Asari realized she wasn't dealing with a standard military officer. He was something far more than that, perhaps intelligence. Or their own version of specters. "That does not change the fact that you attacked a member of the Citadel colonies. Continued aggression will result in open conflicts," Ladanya said sternly. Being a matriarch, she had adopted a more motherly approach in most situations. "Funny, it is within my opinion that the Turians fired first. With your logic, shouldn't the Turians be subjugated to Shinobi law?" the man replied. His voice was sarcastic, as he peered straight through Ladanya. The Asari noticed Marvis flinched out of the corner of her eye. "The Turians were merely upholding council law. Your race is still new, and needed to be educated on the dangers of activating a dormant mass relay." Marvis had spoken up this time, understandably. The alien turned to him in what would amount to an annoyed glance, a flicker of amusement in his eyes, as he addressed the Turian. "Oh yes, trying to kill us was the perfect way to educate us. Tell me, when you teach your children maths, do you do it with the threat of a gun or an explosive-induced headache?" Marvis frowned, and was about to make a retort before Torin interrupted him, impatience in his voice. "There is no further need for this talk. Either lower your weapons or the Citadel fleet shall open fire. Your fleet is severely outnumbered, and you can surely see you cannot outlast 3 civilizations in an all-out war." Torin was sure the alien was merely biding time for reinforcements, or for their ground troops, to properly dig in on the colony. As a Solarian, he saw no point in talking, and should instead attack the fleet before they could properly retaliate. In his mind, the battle had already been won. Statistically, the enemy fleet could not overpower them even with their unknown technology, and Torin could tell his colleagues agreed with him. To their surprise, the alien threw his head back and laughed, clutching his chest and looking like he was about to keel over at Torin's threat. The Solarian was confused. He didn't know why the alien was laughing. When the alien finally stopped, did he understand? It was a trait that the Solarian had noticed in many species evolved from harsh worlds, a stare that meant that you were prey, and he was the predator. But the look that this Takashi was giving him was more akin to an apex predator toying with its food. It was foreboding, a promise of death. For a moment Torin recalculated his odds of survival. "You should not underestimate the Shinobi. If you threaten us, we will fight back, and we will crush your people into smithereens," the alien declared before the transmission was roughly cut off. Ladanya ran her hand over her head crest in exasperation. Her orders were clear, capture or elimination was at her discretion. Now, there was only one option to choose from. Order all ships to battle stations. Her colleagues winked off beside her, and in what would amount to practiced ease, the Citadel formed a tight formation around the Destiny Ascension. Turian dreadnoughts warmed up their main guns, while Asari and Solarian frigates launched forward, their guardian lasers prepared to rain a red-hot death on the enemy ships, while they were followed closely by Turian fighters. Ladanya watched all of this calmly. She had felt no worry or cause for concern. She was expecting a quick and decisive victory that swayed to her favor. What she had not realized, though, was that the Shinobi would not be willing to give her that victory, without at the very least giving her hell for it. Well, unluckily for her, Shinobi never did do things at the least. Matriarch enemy ships launching fighters. "There's 15 squadrons, no 25. No, it's dear goddess." The ensign brought her hand to her mouth in muted horror, as a literal sea of enemy fighters, blocky and sleek, launched out of every ship with a hangar bay. There were even some frigates launching a small group of fighters, as they raced to meet the Citadel fleet's forward force. And that they did. In a fiery display of explosions, lightning, and fire, Turian fighters engaged the Shinobi zone. The enemy's shields held admirably well against the Turian weapons, while the enemy's silver lance of energy broke through the fighters' shields and demolished them in 2 hits. The frigates found their guardian lasers being wholly overworked, as swarms of ships converged on them, blasting holes into their hulls or destroying their engines, to make it easier for the fighters to lay waste on the frigates. While that was happening, the enemy ships turned their weapons onto the Citadel fleet. Ladanya gritted her teeth, and made to put a stop to that, all ships opened fire. The Citadel fleet responded immediately. Large slugs of molten metal raced past the expanse of space, and crashed against the alien ships, creating chemical dust clouds where they impacted. Ladanya was awe-stricken when the largest of the ships, the Behemoth, raced forward through the dust clouds, and fired a strange projectile unlike their fighter's white lance of energy. If Ladanya paid enough attention, she'd have thought the projectile was solid rock, but she couldn't because it had already impacted against the Destiny Ascension, and the Asari found herself being launched into the air by the sheer kinetic energy of the hit. Shields at 65. It would have been a lot worse if the projectile hadn't nicked one of our frigates. Ladanya lifted herself up unsteadily, and in one hard glare, straightened her posture to a rigid and professional stance. She now recognized the power of this species, and would face them like a true commander. "How many enemy ships did we take down from the initial barrage?" she ordered. An ensign hovering over a terminal was quick to report. 4 enemy cruisers have been destroyed, while 2 are disabled. Ladanya bit her bottom lip. Those were good numbers. Now all she had to worry about were the 30 ships still operational. Matriarchs are firing. Ladanya turned towards her view screen, and opened her mouth in horror, as the enemy ship's first salvo impacted her fleet, and decimated it. The white lances of energy that impacted cruisers and dreadnoughts, destroyed their shields or greatly damaged ships' wide systems, while the same rocky projectiles crushed frigates, and took a chunk off other ship shields. But what had really shocked her was when she saw a large fiery serpent spewed from a dreadnought-sized ship with enough side cannons to shoot down 20 ships either side, suddenly ram into one of the dreadnoughts by the Destiny's side, and utterly destroyed. She could hear the screams of the ship's personnel, as the ungodly creature wrapped itself around the ship, and crushed it. Matriarch 13 ships are either destroyed or disabled, while several others are reporting minor to serious damage. Ladanya was shocked. Her fleet, though still strong, had taken a far greater beating than what the enemy fleet should have been able to deliver. Get the ships to Titan formations. Call the frigates back their own fighter control. Get bombers on those dreadnoughts before they can cause any more trouble, Ladanya ordered. The ships followed their commander's orders, and began reforming in an attempt to launch another salvo at the enemy fleet before their dreadnoughts or cruisers could fire again. But what they did not understand was that sometimes the greatest threat was in the smallest of sizes. Captain Harry Dragneel, Tobacco Squadron, Null Class, Hound Fighter Interceptors. Captain Harry Dragneel grinned happily, as she cracked her neck, her long light pink weaving round her neck, as she clamped strong, and yet delicate fingers on her fighter's control yoke. With confidence that belied her years of experience, the woman screened her fighters into the heat of battle, launching her secondary lightning cannons into 2 Turian fighters, trying to shoot down a Hound fighter. Harry grinned in undisguised glee, as her skills easily outclassed every other shinobi pilot. Her family, the Dragneels, were a respected family on Earthland, and kept close ties to many of the original families of Fairy Tail. Initially, after the disbandment of Gil pending the formation of the NSA, the Dragneels had a long-standing relationship with the military, second to only the Scarless, who were once rumored to be descendants of escaped Uzumakis. Though Dragneel's military history had always been in the army trotting Mac machine guns, she herself was the first to have joined the Navy, and she had shattered her father's skepticism as she smashed through her classes, and was now proving a force to be reckoned with on the battlefield. Her hands danced across the consoles, as her squadron of Null fighters formed up beyond her. "Alright boy, you know the mission." Harry spoke through the pilot-favored Yamanaka telepathic seals located on the collar of her flight suit. "Yes ma'am," they replied in unison. Harry brought her slightly larger than average fighter on a course towards one of the dreadnoughts in the enemy formation. The Dragneel slowed her breaths, as she thumbed the button on her control yoke, slow easy breath, as the chakra readings on her terminals blinked to full green. In that moment all of her training, as a Null pilot had been recognized, all the blood and sweat, extreme zero-G training, and grueling flight simulations. The pink-haired female was grinning like a mad woman remembering those moments. Launching Fox 1. Her thumb lurched forward, the world around her became agonizingly slow, as she watched her fellow Nulls doing the same. The very tip of their aircrafts glowing a luminescent blue, as their large frames weaved through the battle virtually unnoticed. Humorously she spotted one Null fighter level itself with her, the emblem of the Nulls on his right wing. Quietly, Harry marveled at it, as the discharge lights of her cockpit blinked red. The emblem was that of a blue ball of chakra flanked by wind and fire motivated with the earth and water underneath it. The crown jewel of Shinobi. The weaponized Rasengan. In one mighty shot, Harry's fighter shuddered, as it launched its mighty payload, the ball no bigger than a fist joined by its brethren, as they simultaneously impacted against one dreadnought, tearing through metal, and causing the ship to implode, its wreckage of twisted metal slamming into the ships nearest to it, while 2 valiant cruisers trying to defend the large ship were obliterated to nothing but space and dust. Harry felt her lips quirk upwards at the display of destruction, the smile having forced itself up long ago. In one mighty turn she had soared past the dead ship, and pressed her thumb into her Yamanaka seal, breathless at the scene. That struck one. All nulls its open season. Have fun. There were several cheers, as the fighters broke off, moving out admirably, as they struck down any, and all targets of interest. In one swift and calculated strike, the nulls had lived so true to their legacy of sheer power, that a blond man in heaven had shed a tear. An SA tears of regret. Takashi Saika, it would appear we are needed, Takashi said ruefully, as he eyed the battle ahead. Though the shinobi were losing ships, and on a long scale would have probably been overwhelmed, if it weren't for the new prototype fighters, then the battle would have taken far longer. Perhaps we had overestimated our opponents. Tsuchi murmured, still slightly uncomfortable at the proximity of Takashi. Yes, and here I thought I was being smart at making up this plan. It was a simple plan. Half of the fleet would meet the enemy, while the other half would hide behind several planets, all engines and power cores offline. After Takashi had made the call and ended it, the maneuver was supposed to have been activated if it had been needed. Now Takashi and a half of the fleet was holding ground at the mass relay, picking off any ships trying to retreat. The maneuver was now practically dead, considering the shinobi forces have now engaged at knife range with the enemy ships, and if they did move in, it'd be at the threat of hitting a friendly. This is kinda boring. One of the ensigns muttered, as he manned his station. Takashi grinned widely, and made a perfect about face before heading towards a very special place on the ship. Rear Admiral, if you'd be so kind, I'd like to try something. Tucci didn't even hesitate when he nodded his head, and the 9th member of the Guardians had left his breach with very explicit instructions. Dutifully the NSA tears of regret oriented itself towards the mass relay. Its main gun heated up, as a coil had been chambered into the weapon. There was a tense silence all around space, as the crew of each ship stopped what they were doing, and stared at the flagship of the fleet. They watched, as a bloody red mist began to ooze slightly out of the main weapon. They watched, as the main gun glowed a hot yellow, the hardening seals barely able to stop the metal from melting at the sheer intensity. Then, as sudden as a blink, an exceptionally fast orb of purplish chakra was launched free, the dark color melding into the background of space, as it crashed against the mass relay, but not quite destroying. But the explosion that happened after the impact sent the gyroscopic rings to crumble into the ball that orbited. Dangerously, the energy levels of the mass relay spiked upwards, threatening to go supernova, and destroy the entire solar system, before a sudden shock wave had filled the void. The purple ball of chakra had yet to finish, and a second explosion occurred, far more powerful than the first, and it had sent the mass relay soaring out of the solar system to explode harmlessly into deep space. In one moment, whether knowingly or not, the shinobi had declared war on all those living in Citadel space. In a quick and decisive moment, the Citadel Council had realized the threat that hovered above them. Their ships now ran the risk of being obsolete, their soldiers, once strong and captivating, now cowardly, as the enemy marched forward on a campaign of war. This day marked the very first day that the Citadel Alliance found themselves regretting their decisions, as with the loss of their flagship, and the sudden disappearance of the mass relay, the Citadel now found themselves subject to a war of shadows and deadly games. It marked the first time a civilization so mighty and powerful had challenged the might of all in Citadel space, and without even knowing the fundamental use of Izo. It marked the rise of the Shinobi Alliance. It marked the rise of a new galaxy. Captain Saren Osman fiddled with her assault rifle, as her team of commandos loitered around the base that they were currently stationed. Originally she had been deployed in the Terminus system, scouting out the indigenous life, and watching the Batarians, but the sudden recall had sent hundreds of Asari commandos displaced on Thesha, awaiting orders or assignments to be issued. Some lucky commandos had been sent out with Turian and Solarian forces. However, most of the commandos were merely wasting space, until the chat forums finally decided on the best way for the Asari to contribute in the war. Saren just says it, as a waste of time. Even if the civilian population were pissing themselves because they were incapable of believing the Destiny Ascension had been destroyed, she was not a civilian. Unlike them, she understood the Ascension as a ship, a large and expensive ship, but a ship nonetheless, and it could have been destroyed in a myriad of different ways, half of which were particularly impressive. It was in her opinion that eventually, the aliens would have to bow to the Citadel Council. Surely they could not support a war with 3 species, and they had even allowed a 5-month period of grace for their enemy to solidify their forces and secure their worlds. An idiotic and naive move. She believed that they were merely children poking against the flames of war. To emphasize this, a group of heavily armed Asari commandos walked by, talking loud enough for Saren to hear that they were being deployed on one of the border worlds of Citadel space. The captain sighed, as she continued to calibrate her gun, briefly listening to the grunts of her soldiers sparring behind her, when an Asari stepped next to her. Captain Saren. The Asari High Command has called for you to the command room. Saren looked to the Asari, and frowned before sheathing her weapon on her back, and nodding to her. Right. I know my way, there's no need to escort me. The commander nodded before she turned, and headed towards the sparring rings dotting the yard of the base. Saren watched her go for a moment before heading to the command room. Passing by several Asari who stood straight in respect, the blue female entered the command room to be greeted with an Asari, a non-commando, handing her a small device used for secure chats with high command. "This is Captain Saren," she said into the device. The device hummed for a moment before a small holographic image of an Asari appeared. "Captain Saren," the Asari began, "your unit is being reassigned to the Turian Dreadnought." Broker Saren nodded her head, before asking the mandatory question of why. "You'll be assisting in the Turian counter-offensive against the Shinobi Alliance. Solarian STG units have been capable of finding a mass relay connecting to an area calculated to be within Shinobi space." Saren seemed surprised by this. "Will there be any other commando squads following us?" The Asari looked thoughtful for a moment before she answered. 50 other squads are preparing to be shipped out, as we speak. Most of them have had extensive tours in the Terminus system like you, and your team have had." Saren nodded in acceptance, as she moved to hand the device back, but before she could outstretch her hand a large shockwave filled the area around her. The non-commando Asari fell to the with a loud yelp, as members of the command room held on to anything nearby to stifle their own fall. "What just happened?" The device yelled out. Evidently the Asari who was talking to Saren had felt it too. "Something happened on the southern side of the planet. Transmissions of large explosions riddling major population centers. Waiting reports of gunfire on the streets. Ma'am, several cruisers and frigates of unknown origin have entered the atmosphere and are offloading troops on the ground. Confirmed to be the Alien Alliance." By that time Saren had already left the command room, her commando training kicking in before she could make a face of surprise, as she raced to find her squad, ignoring the sudden crumbling Asari architecture falling around her. She had spotted her Asari comrades long before they had spotted her, and the Asari clicked her tongue, as she tried to prepare her weapons for combat. "Ikru, Bravo Company, 2nd Platoon, Platoon Jonan C." C pressed his back into the wall he was hiding behind, as his 20-man platoon took up positions near him. The Ikru platoon was part of a 12,800-man invasion force of the planet Thesha. The 10 divisions of Ikru and army soldiers were currently spread out around the main settlements of the planet, keeping their guns tucked close to their chest, and kunai knives within easy combat was hell even for a shinobi. C gritted his teeth, as small explosions slammed against his cover, and his small platoon responded with a hail of lightning rounds. 100 Asari commandos surrounded C and his men after they got separated from their parent unit. Now it was a firefight between his men and some of the Citadel races. C pulled himself out of cover and clicked his gun, sending his rounds into the head of 2 Asari and seriously wounding 3 more. His shields flashed blue, and the shinobi was able to dodge a volley of mass effect bullets long enough to roll forward back into the cover of a smashed and burning car. Peeking out of cover, C noticed 2 of his shinobi sprint forward and ate up the distance between them and the commandos. One of the Asari brought a shotgun to bear on them, but at the last minute the shinobi jumped over the deadly pellets and brought a heel onto one of the shinobi's heads, dislocating it and driving her blue forehead into the ground, creating cracks at where it impacted. The other shinobi ducked underneath the barrel of the Asari, aiming for him, and bringing his neck up, had effectively broken the weapon into 2, and then sent a palm thrust into her abdomen, sending her flying away and breaking through a nearby wall. "This is Platoon Jonan C. I have Asari commandos swarming my position. Please advise," C yelled into his radio seal. The Asari had set up sniper units on the buildings opposite theirs, and if it wasn't for their numbers, then C and his men would have bull rushed them by now. "Roger that," diverting nearby assets to assist a storm handler, a woman with a high-cut voice replied. C didn't pay attention, as Asari had somehow managed to get close to him, and tried to blow his brains out point blank. C had effectively twisted his head around the gun, making her rounds pass harmlessly to the side. The Asari tried to pistol whip him, but the shinobi was faster, and brought his fist into the Asari's stomach, feeling his knuckles dig into her stomach before she was sent flying away from the impact, like a spring. The bullet from the lucky Asari splashed against his shields, but a quicksand from one of his men had sent her, and the Asari nearest her into the ground. "How I wish Mamachi and Yuki were here," C muttered to himself. An explosion hit his back, sending his cover flying, while his shields had absorbed the hit, chakra connecting his feet to the ground, having prevented him from getting sent into the air. Exposed, C dropped to the ground in a prone position, and brought his sights onto the Asari, wishing he also had a Mac machine gun in his hands, rather than an IR. The Asari's bullets pinched against his armor, and angrily, C brought his hands onto the ground, and a rock wall sprouted out, giving C some cover from the Asari. "Fuck." C cursed, as pieces of his cover began crumbling away. He could dodge the bullets, but having more than a dozen people shooting at you was suicide even for a shinobi, unless of course C was disjointed, then maybe he'd have a chance. Did somebody call for backup? His radio seal suddenly lit up, as a loud female voice boomed through. Blinking owlishly, C barely brought his head up before the iconic sound of a Mac machine gun was heard, slamming against the Asari lines, and forcing them back. C felt his heart sagged in relief upon spotting an army company landing onto the ground from a nearby roof. The shinobi had dropped too close to the Asari, and were now engaged in hand-to-hand combat. C was particularly eyeing one violet-haired woman, the green patch with 2 crossed kunai on her left arm symbolizing her rank, as Jonin Lieutenant, wailing on 5 Asari commandos. One of the commandos threw a ball of some strange energy at the violet-haired shinobi, but she didn't seem affected by it, as she pumped chakra to her feet, and sent a powerful kick into the Asari's head, pulverizing the lower jaw, and lifting her high into the air. The other 4 Asari grew enraged at the loss of their ally, and quickly converged on the lone shinobi. Bad move on their part. The lieutenant grabbed the extended hands of 2 of the Asari, and broke the hand, forcing their bone to shred through their skin, and jut out by the elbow. The Asari screamed in pain, but the shinobi silenced them by ramming their own bones into their necks, forcing them into the ground, and stomping down on them to properly nail them to the spot. The remaining 2 hesitated, giving the lieutenant the opportunity to race past the distance between within the fraction of a blink, and sent a palm thrust into one Asari's head, forcing her head far enough back to snap her spine. After the corpse fell to the ground, the Asari found herself lifted off the ground, and brought back down onto the ground, cracking the ground, and killing her. After her show was done, the Jonin lieutenant cracked her neck, and turned to C, a shit-eating grin on her face. "You the space jockey I'm supposed to save." C looked at her oddly. There was just something about her that set off all the warning bells in his head. Then she said, "Akeno Midarashi, 3rd Mindwar Infantry Company." Now there's the ringer. Not only is she a former insurrectionist, she's a fucking Midarashi. Yeah, I'm with the Bravo Company." C looked mildly uncomfortable, as she invaded his private space. His Iku soldiers were too busy mopping up the Asari commandos to pay attention to him. "How's the operation going?" However uncomfortable C was, he had dashed those thoughts away for a more important subject. Midarashi looked thoughtful, as she placed a delicate finger on her chin. "You want it sugar-coated or laid bare?" she asked, a suggestive tone under laid bare. "Whatever you like." C grimaced slightly to himself, as he caught on to what she meant. Laid bare. Then she winked at him, much to his chagrin. "The army is reporting losses. Getting bottlenecked in the streets isn't fun, and we're just now getting the hang of their little blue magic stuff or whatever. And I heard the Iker companies Alpha and Delta reached the city center." The Midarashi listed off. "So Operation Providence Keep is a success?" he asked. She grinned at him. "I'm game for crushing some more blue bitches otherwise." C nodded his head, and together the 2 groups of shinobi proceeded to run amok in Asari City. The heart of Citadel culture had been taken. The universe learned that not even their fortress worlds were safe. One day after Operation Providence Keep, the planet of Horizon was a small industrial world at the very edge of shinobi-controlled space, and therefore the nearest to the Citadel theater of war. The planet itself was unremarkable, that is, if you discount the giant moth-looking Yggdrasil tree that took up 15 kilometers of the planet. The planet Horizon was one of the few mass-producing shipyards of the Shinobi Alliance, the other being Shinobi no Kai, Jiko, Durorge, and Saying. The planet itself was highly defended by the Shinobi Alliance, given how long it takes to produce an Yggdrasil tree, not only big enough to create ships of all sizes, but provides the raw materials to manufacture crystallized chakra efficiently, and that in itself didn't speak to the sheer volumes of chakra it produces. Most of the cities on Horizon were dominated by large towering trees, and vines crisscrossing around them. The sheer volume of chakra in the air of the planet was enough to turn any hardened shinobi into a hippie. So it was no wonder that there were a total of 30 ships in orbit, 15 frigates, 10 cruisers, and 5 battlecruisers with 3 orbital defense platforms guarding the planet from an invasion. So, with all these factors combined, it was no surprise when Horizon was chosen to be the command center of the entire shinobi war effort. Indeed, within the large hollow tree of the Yggdrasil, its impenetrable bark offering the perfect shield and privacy, were 3 of the shinobi's military leaders spearheading most of the operations, while the cage was away on other duties. Those people are the Anbu Commander, Falcon, High Cage Ikra Commander, Takumi, and the High Cage Army Commander, Kevin Goldfield. These people were currently spread out around a small holographic table projecting a galactic map, a small part of it signifying shinobi-controlled space, while the rest was marked bright red, enemy territory. The Ikra commander was dressed in all black fatigues, black combat vest over his chest, and ceremonial katana sheathed on his hip. Over his eyes was an accelerated information gear, the spiritual successor to the Gale Force reading glasses, that helped in tactical planning. Next to the Ikra commander was the army commander who was dressed in pure light desert sand camo with green jungle stripes, combat fatigues under combat vest. Completing the ensemble was a pair of armored greaves. Falcon was dressed in the normal Anbu uniform, the only difference being his black and green cloak over his armor, and Tanto being sheathed next to his right thigh. Unlike the Ikra commander, both Falcon and Kevin had opted to not wear the aid glasses. Reports from the Anbu on Thesha are stating that the main military force on the planet has resorted to guerrilla warfare, coming in and causing some trouble before our shinobi could snuff them out, Falcon said, as he leaned over the holographic image of Thesha, and if a bystander was looking at him, they'd have described him as a benevolent god, waiting to wrought punishment on the wicked. Divert the Anbu operatives to deal with them. The troops have to stay within city walls if they don't want to get bombarded in orbit, Kevin advised. This isn't my first rodeo, you know, Falcon commented dryly. Kevin's face scrunched up slightly, but he shook Falcon's remark away and focused on the hologram. Third Fleet has been repurposed on guard duty, while First, Second, and Third Fleets are prepared to make a move into enemy territory. Kevin and Falcon turned to Takumi as he spoke, and both saw no reason to interrupt. The question, however, is whether we should spearhead towards Thessia, or should we open up new fronts on the Turian or Solarian side. Kevin cupped his chin in thought, idly watching, as Takumi shifted his glasses over his eyes, and responded, pros and cons. Falcon answered the question, heading to Thessia. Get our boys back, and take the species that have a monopoly on trade. Cons is that the enemy would most likely suspect that, and we'd lose a good amount of ships to get to Thessia, not to mention to sidetrack and take areas of interest, while the other option lets us put more pressure on the Turian or Solarians, while at the same time maintaining our grip on the Asari. Bad news is that the troops on Thessia would probably not be seeing a relief force anytime soon. Falcon's listed off calmly, and Kevin was sure he was saying it out of experience. I don't know how I feel about leaving troops on an enemy homeworld, surrounded by enemy fleets, and unsure if they could even eat anything there. Kevin sounded uneasy, given the fact he was still slightly new to command. Since he had become the High Cage right at the end of the Colonial Rebellion, he was far less dehumanized than his counterparts. Takumi gave Kevin an unimpressed look, and Falcon was doing the same, though it was hidden underneath his mask. Kid, we all gotta make sacrifices, some of them bad, and some of them good, but these choices are things that we have to make. In these situations, it's best our moral compass is turned off. Kevin flattened his lips, and didn't meet the eyes of Takumi, as he merely stood there with his hands around his chin. Falcon sighed to himself before he jabbed a finger down towards a small cluster of stars. If we're opening up new fronts, then we should aim here. Takumi blinked, as his eyes followed Falcon's finger, and nearly growled when he saw the small planet. Palavin, he spat, it's as good a place as any. We'll probably have to skirt around the borders, and then go in from the flank. No way is our fleet going to survive a hit from the fleet they have stationed over their home planet. Falcon nodded his head in agreement, and began writing these notes down on a small journal he kept on his person. Shouldn't the Vice Admiral be here since he is in charge of the fleets? Kevin sounded confused at this, and both senior members sighed. Damn rookies, they thought in unison. The Vice Admiral is in charge of the fleets, yes, but during wartime land engagements are as much space as dirt. We plan the strategy that is most acceptable in terms of a dirt soldier's perspective. Then we forward this information to the Vice Admiral. Then he'd either accept them or refuse them. It's how the system works, Takumi explained to him. Seems like we're doing all the work. Kevin didn't seem to like that notion. To his surprise, however, Falcon wrapped his arms around himself and laughed into the air after his comment. Trust me, Rook, if you see his desk and all the damn papers on it, you wouldn't be saying that. Kevin made a small lopsided grin as the Anbu commander patted his shoulder, and Falcon pretended not to see it. What about the land troops though? The enemy's fleets already outnumber ours. What about their ground troops? Falcon stretched out his back and allowed Takumi to answer the question. The Asari don't have a standing military per se. At least 9% of their population actually enlists, while their young ones usually join up in mercenary bands and whatnot. By a guess, at least half their population knows how to fight given their long lives and profession choices. Takumi paused for a slight moment. The Turians are a martial state, imperial, and warlike. Their economy is mostly headed by the Volus, but the few Turian companies they have are built upon the foundations of war. They make a profit out of violence without violence, not a bad market scheme. We should have a talk with the Cage about this. Now about the Solarians. Takumi looked pointedly at Falcon, and the Anbu commander grimaced. The Solarians are a bunch of smart eggheads who specialize in intelligence gathering and experimentation. I already filed in some paperwork with reworked protocols detailing proper action to be taken with shinobi corpses. At the least, if destruction of the body is improbable, then destroying the chakra system is imperative. And if a soldier finds himself tied to a table, then self-destruction is mandatory. All three of the commanders grimaced, each reliving their own memories of psychotic scientists trying to unlock the secrets of chakra. All in favor of opening a front on the Solarians. As one, all three commanders agreed, and they forwarded their information to the Vice Admiral. Terminus system. One can never truly blame the shinobi for their paranoia. As powerful as they were in the eyes of the galactic world, to themselves their power would mean nothing if they didn't know their enemies, their own fear of a weapon all on its own. So it was no wonder that the shinobi had spent 5 months just garnering as much information as it could from Validia and the prisoners of war they had. Now their knowledge of the known galaxy was rudimentary and basic, but they knew enough to be comfortable with dealing with their new and strange enemy. But no matter how they garnered information, whether through asking or mind-raping someone, there was always mention of a place known as the Terminus system, and no matter how deep the shinobi digged, all they found was rumors and tales. For shinobi, rumors were a powerful weapon, and they did not like it being used against them. Thus, they sent an expeditionary ship to discover what exactly the Terminus system was. That ship was the NSA Karama. Kiro was wrestling with both sleep deprivation and listening to his pilots banter like an old married couple. The NSA captain was rubbing the sleep out of his eyes, as the NSA Kurama made a full burn through this terminus system. As the first and only Saratobi-class exploration and defense ship, it was the most obvious candidate in traversing this new and potentially dangerous place. Many Turians and Asari that the shinobi had interrogated had referred to the system, one place in particular, as the place where secrets lie or the place where law does not exist. For shinobi, secrets and lawlessness were everyday problems, but unknown secrets and laws weren't. For all this, Kitaro wasn't exactly worried. He was giddy. He had become the captain of the NSA Kurama to be an explorer and adventurer. That changed after he went on a self-made campaign against pirates and slavers, further when he went to war with the 3 new alien species. But now he was discovering something, making a name for himself in a world other than gunfire and explosions. The part of him wished Tanoka was by his side, but seeing just how dangerous the galaxy is, after the introduction of alien life, he felt better that she was on reserve with the gun brigade in Konoha City. But that didn't mean she wasn't going to stay in touch with her older brother. Hey big bro, you should see what's going on in Konoha City. The people are practically calling for news of the war, and not for the reasons you might think. The gun brigade is on high alert now, and I heard you were part of the retaliatory fleet against the aliens. Are you okay? You should have messaged me or sent a letter. I was so worried. Some Inyazuka clan members and Yamanaka members stopped by the Uzumaki compound. They told me how they had lost some members to the war already. I don't like this. And I don't like how you're getting pulled away to some dangerous place like mom and dad. Just promise this war won't take you away like the last one did to mom and dad. Love, you sis. Kitaro was smiling softly as he read the letter on his datapad. The Uzumaki family had never really been big. There were a few families and whatnot, but they were all tight-knit, closer than any other family. He, and Hinoka especially so. He sighed to himself, lost in thought, and quietly kept his datapad on a slot in his chair's armrest. The Uzumaki took a moment to enjoy the sights of the stars in front of him. The wonders of its mesh of purple, white, and black gave off breathtaking in Kitaro's opinion, and he had realized just how wondrous and beautiful this strange world he traveled through, a world full of mysterious and untapped knowledge. Sir, scans have picked up an anomaly, short bursts of seismic activity on a nearby planet, sir. It's not naturally occurring, might be worth a check, Carlos announced by his side. Kitaro nodded his head, passing the information to Nani and Izuka, and getting the ship warmed up. This better not be a bomb or something, Kitaro jokes, as the ship turned on its axis towards the nearby planet. Kitaro reclined comfortably against his chair, and listened passingly to his pilots arguing. And I'm telling you, the crystal chakra core is fine, there's no reason to vent off excess chakra yet. Jacob whispered harshly, as his hands danced across the ship's controls, maintaining the shop's rudimentary and complex functions. But I got a spike in the engines, and too much power is being pulled out of the Namika seals. You and I both know what could happen if the seals malfunction even to the percentile, Nani whispered just as harshly back. Jacob looked upward in exasperation and cursed. The vent will only do a forced cooldown of the core, and I'll have to circumvent the system to restart the transmission seals. What's worse? Death or 5 minutes of extra work. I'm burning off calories for that extra work. You're such a lazy fat ass. Nani huffed as she brought her hands down through her instruments, a quick application of chakra to help boost its effects. One of these days you're gonna get a kid who, she paused, as a red warning light flashed across her screen, the same thing happening to her co-pilot. You see that right? Jacob breathed. Nani was silent as she watched the readings. If the scans were showing anything, it was that a very large wave of Izo was traveling towards them, and fast. I'm blaming this all on you, Nani hissed. Jacob was silent as the wave struck the Kurama, and havoc reigned supreme. The seals connecting the various pieces of equipment on the ship with the chakra core literally lit up in alarm as the foreign energy filled their systems and turned them to an energies equivalent to a drunken stupor. The terminals lining against the walls began exploding in blue fires of chakra as naval officers and servicemen found their faces torched and mangled as overwhelming heat and debris slashed through them. Kitaro was fortunate to have been seated in the middle of the entire room, and before he was able to even sit up straight, 2 identical explosions occurred, he himself being sandwiched in between. The Uzumaki found his white uniform catching on fire, and had just enough time to shield his face from the worst of the hit, but his right arm was left a smoldering mess. Kitaro's last sight was his first officer jumping forward and shielding Yumi Yamanaka from pieces of shrapnel impaling her, and then there was darkness. Did the weapon work? The crazed female voice asked, her mesmerizing voice offset by her twitchy trigger finger. It appears that it worked, another voice answered, the distinct restless tone of a Solarian. Within the shadows the female smiled dangerously. Our jobs are done then. The female walked out of the shadows that her ships provided, accompanied by 2 others. Both she and her companions were dressed in faded yellow armor with a white logo plastered at the front, slow sadistic smirks playing at their lips, and blue skin shining in the sunlight. It's time for the eclipse to go, eluding Jonah's smile would have made a lesser man crawl away in fear. Codex. Yggdrasil. The Yggdrasil is a biologically engineered Shinju sapling made near the Shinobi space age. The Yggdrasil trees take a century to grow into a fully grown tree, but when it does, its height would nearly rival that of the clouds. Unlike the Shinju tree, the Yggdrasil acts more as a connection between nature chakra and human chakra. Because of its large size and its near supernatural abilities, it constantly vents excess chakra into an atmosphere. This in turn makes whatever planet Yggdrasil is located in to be very rich in chakra, and thus, it isn't uncommon to see trees taller than the highest shinobi skyscraper. These Yggdrasil trees find themselves now being used as shipyards where shinobi ships and chakra crystals are manufactured like clockwork. The tree's impenetrable bark also makes it the perfect base of operations or bunker during wartime. Are also the birthplaces of fairies, though only 3 known incidents have happened. The Yggdrasil tree is essential for the shinobi war machine, as well as any future economic and agricultural endeavor for the Shinobi Alliance. Codex Eternano, a rare genetic mutation only seen with those of Earthland. Eternano is an amazing biological innovation that notable members of Earthland have been privileged to attain due in part to their nature chakra-rich environment. For years the people of Earthland had considered the abilities of the Eternano as magic when in actuality they were using and controlling the power of nature chakra. Though this in itself is impressive, as every mage on Earthland had the capability of becoming a sage, the Eternano is not quite at the level of Sanin mode, or carry the same destructive power as the tailed beasts. In modern times mages find themselves in the army or navy with many of Earthland's innovations, such as the lacrimas and such, being used by the civilian community, as it was cheaper than their chakra equivalent, for whatever reason. Codex Mercenary bands. Sometime after the Pirate Wars, a multitude of mercenary bands had appeared all throughout shinobi countries, such as Fiori and Despin. These mercenary bands were ruthless individuals composed of Ronin, former gunmen, and dark mages, all united for the prospect of money. These mercenary bands reached a far greater threat than pirates ever did, and the Uchiha police, before the Police Acceptance Act, found themselves calling more and more for the AFS's assistance. For the next coming years mercenary bands continued to run amok on the shinobi homeworld, and after space travel their effects reached even to the stars. Nowadays however mercenary bands perform behind the curtains dealings with various shinobi governments, fighting proxy wars, and performing the less than acceptable acts of war. See the Pennington Station Massacre. There are still quite a number of mercenary bands still in operation, even after the NSA's march against them. The most notable of them were the Ghost Mercenary Group founded and led by Takashi the current Kyubi Jinchuriki. Thanks for watching my video, leave a like if you enjoyed my video, and also do consider subscribing to my channel for more awesome content. And make sure to check out the author of this fanfic, link is in the description. See you next time, till then sayonara.